Good morning and welcome on behalf of the International Foundation for Muslim Theology to the second day of our seminar on Godtalk, Divine Communication and Revelation. Yesterday, we listened to very invigorating talks on topics such as the different levels of God's communication with and through creation, the meaning and significance of prophets being shepherds, what it means for us today, free will, divine determining, and its compatibility with logic, supplication as a means of communicating with God, the many different proofs of the trustworthiness of the prophet's messages and teachings in the Quran on mental and emotional care. Today, for our chair, Dr. Mehmet Özal, kindly takes over. I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Iqbal Nasim, who has kindly agreed to share his thoughts and experience with us. Iqbal is an educator, speaker, and writer, but also a former investment banker and nonprofit CEO at the National Zakat Foundation. Iqbal delivers transformational educational experiences to help people lead truly God-centered lives. He does this by offering courses such as Transformation of Prayer, which helps establish a connection during Salah, or Club Revelation to increase understanding, appreciation, and love of God and the Quran. For more information, you can visit iqbalnasim.com, which is his page. Thank you, Iqbal, for joining us today. I'd like now leave the floor to our chairman, Dr. Mehmet Özal. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that introduction to Banur and to the second day of the conference. Iqbal, over to you, please.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. I begin in the name of God. All praise belongs to God, and blessings and peace upon the messenger of God. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon all of you. Well, thank you very much for this, for the invitation, and for considering me worthy of this esteemed gathering and its audience. I was unable, unfortunately, to participate in some of the talks yesterday. And probably will be unable to for the rest of today because, as was mentioned, I think before some of you came in, I'm currently away on holiday with the family, and so I managed to steal away this sort of few minutes just to share a few thoughts with you. But then, unfortunately, soon after I'll have to depart. But I do. I've been aware for a long time about the aims and objectives of the IFMT and what everybody here is sort of up to, and of course, very supportive of all of your efforts. I only hope that I'm not going to be wasting your time in the next 10 minutes by sharing with you a few thoughts on the talk title is Popularizing Godtalk, Challenges and Opportunities. And so what I'm going to do is just share a few observations as I have them from my brief experience in simply trying to connect people with their creator. My work is primarily focused on those who are Muslims, who identify as Muslim, and who are interested in deepening their connection, I would say normalizing their connection with their Lord. And so I want to just point out what three challenges I've experienced or that I see that people experience are, and then maybe some opportunities, and then perhaps if there's any questions or discussion, we can have that. As was mentioned earlier, the three areas that I'm particularly focused on and around which I've developed sort of educational programs, courses, is the issue of salah, of prayer, of Quran, but specifically helping people, introducing people to specific themes of the Quran. So taking more of a thematic approach, and then introducing people to certain messages or themes in the Quran. And then finally, the idea of leadership, which for me simply means the idea of getting people to think about how they are living as, let's say, ambassadors on behalf of God, let's say, meaning that to what extent are we shuhada, like bearing witness, and khulafa, deputies or vicegerents in some way, in the way that we operate and function and live our lives, because we have prioritized this as a responsibility and as a duty, and that we have what is basically the essential prophetic concern for the guidance and well-being of all people. So these are the three areas that I'm concerned with, and it's kind of in that order, meaning that I started teaching this course, developing this course called Transform My Prayer, more than just over a couple of years ago now, and around 2,000 people have taken this course over the last 2 years. Its popularity, no doubt, helped by the lockdown inadvertently, and people actually all of a sudden seeming to want to engage more with this kind of content. And that brings me to the first point, or the first challenge, which is that I think that for whatever reason, and what the reasons are, I don't know, we can examine, but certainly it presents itself still as a challenge today, is that the first challenge I would say that people face is that they simply don't apply sufficient reason when thinking about how they themselves, if you like, relate to God or think about God. So in a way, I think the issue that people face is that either consciously or otherwise, they've almost overcomplicated the dynamic, or the relationship in some way. And so what you tend to find is, I would say these are fairly common experiences, is that for many people, Islam, the idea of Islam comes before the idea of Allah. And it reminds me of something which I think Dr. Colin Turner introduced me to, a set of questions, introduced me to a few years ago. The idea of, do you believe in Allah because you're a Muslim, or are you Muslim because you believe in Allah? Meaning that, is it the kind of existential, almost the Abrahamic reflective process that gets you, firm on the idea of the divine, from which then you explore its further implications? Or is it the fact that you've just grown up as a Muslim in a Muslim household? Typically, for most of my audience, it will be a South Asian household, but now living in the UK, where this has just become a sort of an inherited sort of experience. And therefore, where the social and the cultural and probably even the political seems to precedes the spiritual or the existential. Now, all of these components are important, but I think the ordering is also important. And so what's happened, I think, for many people is that God has become an abstract idea rather than a real living being with whom we have a dynamic interaction. And therefore, what you also see is for many people is a greater or a disproportionate concern with technicalities and legalities over substance. And so this is something which, for example, I think I've observed, and the reason why I started this particular program on Salah, because when I was the chief executive of the National Zakat Foundation and trying to bring to life some of what I understood to be the core principles of Zakat in the UK, and when I was thinking for myself about what a kind of theory of change, if you like, might look like for the future of Islam and Muslims in this country, then of course, Salah and Zakah, as in the Quran, as in the prophetic narrative, are basically inseparable. And to me, it seemed, I could never understand actually for many years as to why amongst scholars, imams, popular figures who are sort of out there educating people, why there was such an absence of a concern for helping people pray in the first place, actually. Most adult Muslims don't pray 5 times a day. And to me, there's almost no bigger crisis. But you wouldn't think that that was the biggest crisis that we are facing as a community based on our own narratives and our own concerns. You might think it's Islamophobia or some other thing going on. But actually, that in and of itself displays the disconnection. And then, of course, which brings me to, just to illustrate directly what I mean by we're not reasonable in the way that we relate to God, is that people who are otherwise educated, professional, whatever, conscientious also, perhaps as Muslims, would, for example, in their prayer, be saying many phrases and many things day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out, perhaps for many years, perhaps for decades. And still today, when asked, what does at-tahiyyatu lillah wa salawatu tayyibat, what does that mean? Would have no idea. Now, if you actually think about it, it's a phenomenally strange thing that people who are otherwise perfectly rational, reasonable, educated, professional, thinking about progress, thinking about advancing, in all different spheres of life, would never have stopped to think, nor were made to stop to think about what the basic statements that they say in prayer even mean in the first place. And therefore, obviously, since when one doesn't know the literal meaning of what one is saying, clearly one cannot mean what they're saying. And so that, to me, goes to the heart of the problem that we are facing, which is the fact that the average person, and I would say the average Muslim, certainly, again, speaking in a UK context primarily, or a quote unquote Western context, that's not sort of self-evident that that's an issue or a problem. It almost needs to be pointed out. Because what's been so deeply ingrained for whatever reason within people is somehow that the substance of the interaction doesn't matter. Whereas in any other communication or interaction, just as in this one or any other one, people would understand that my body language, my tone, the fact that I intend what I say, say what I mean what I say, all matters as part of communication, relationship development and progress, doesn't seem to apply to God. That doesn't apply to God. God, somehow that doesn't matter. And so this is a challenge, but then an opportunity, because then in most cases, when you start to unlock that, that seems to, from in my experience and from the thousands of people who, you know, with whom I have sort of, I suppose, communicated or interacted on this, just on this particular point, that it suddenly unlocks something, you know, huge within them, that realizes that actually it's okay for me to, I mean, not just okay, but it's a must, just as it is in any communication, for me to think about what I'm saying when I am communicating with my Lord. And just as a side point to that, which is outside of
excuse me, Iqbal, time is ticking very quickly. Can we move on to the other two challenges?
Sure, absolutely.
5 minutes,
yeah.
please, if we could wrap it up
Absolutely,
in 5 minutes.
No problem. So the second thing I would mention is that, which is related to the Quran, is that we don't have a culture in which reading and discussing the Quran in whichever language is accessible, say primarily English to most people, is encouraged. So basically the Quran becomes a preserve of the very few. And then any teaching that happens in and around the Quran is very didactic, one-way traffic, not really Socratic, not really particularly engaging. So even though Allah himself in the Quran encourages people to ponder its messages and its verses, the people are never told to do that, really. You know, that message is not, I would say, in sort of the popular Muslim culture or through educated scholars who are out there, that's not something that people are encouraged to do. That's not a narrative that you will hear typically. If there is, it's a fringe narrative. And so again, there's this idea that actually the Quran, ironically, as an apparently universal text, is completely non-universal for most people, either because they're almost have directly or indirectly been made to feel that there isn't an angle for them. They're not qualified to read and to reflect and to take anything from it. And so most people never actually experience the guiding effect of revelation directly, because almost how could they? It's almost wrong for them, perhaps for many people, it's almost wrong to think that I could read and take something from it. In fact, even just the notion of reading the Quran in English, for many people, just as even the idea of using the word God instead of Allah, for many people, like they have to stop to think about, again, otherwise reasonable people, educated, professional, what have you, they have to stop to think as to whether that's an okay thing to do in the first place. That's extremely common, I have found, amongst people. But again, in terms of the opportunity, when people are exposed and sort of almost encouraged, I would say, that, you know, to just to read and to reflect, and obviously not to go wild in terms of their own kind of conclusions and interpretations. And I think most people are pretty responsible in that way. That unlocks something very significant, and it brings challenges, no doubt, but it's certainly something that needs to be more popularized. Finally, the final point, which I think is a very important issue that we are facing when it comes to the notion of popularizing God talk, not just amongst Muslims, but just people generally, is the fact that I do feel that what we're really severely lacking is any articulation of a vision for the societies in which we're living that reflects what God-centered living actually means. So what I mean to say is that on all of the things and the issues that are affecting people in society, believers and otherwise, seem to be our narrative is very absent in public discourse, in the public sphere, about what the implications of God-centered living actually is or are. So for example, when it comes to the whole environmental issue, Muslim voices or faithful voices on the issue of the environment are very, very absent from the debate, from the discussion. We don't seem to have much to say about the big issues that are affecting people coming from our perspective, and or even, you know, simply making the case. So there's one thing about that. There's a lot that's going on from where I sit in terms of making the case for God in a kind of abstract philosophical kind of way to counter sort of, you know, to sort of the new atheists and all of that stuff. So there's certainly been an increase in that kind of work, but I do think that most people aren't as affected by that, you know, that whole, I mean, I'm not saying it's unimportant, it is important, it's very important, but I'm just saying, like, just in a way that I think surely part of the whole prophetic approach, not just the final messenger, but all messengers, was to kind of make the case for why this makes sense practically now for you, given your situation, why this is just better for society. We're not doing that. And that makes the whole thing difficult, because In fact, especially for Muslims, existing Muslims, for many Muslims, their being Muslim is actually causing them, they find that that causes them more problems than otherwise, if anything. So their lived experience. So oftentimes, our vision for society, for what do we actually believe? What do we actually believe? Well, what does the UK look like in 50 years, in 100 years, if everybody was to adopt or suddenly was to believe in God? What's the implication of that, basically? What does society look like? What does the political system look like? What is the implication for justice, for gender relations, for education, for all of the things that affect, for the environment, for all the things that affect people? I think that's really lacking. Like, we don't seem to have that, a narrative or a vision. And I think that what the damage that does, therefore, and I think obviously this is an onus primarily on people of knowledge, on scholars, to come up with this stuff and popularize it, I suppose. But what the damage that does is as if there's not like all the dots aren't connected. You're telling me to believe, you're telling me to have this relationship, you're telling me to interact, but what is the implication or the manifesto, if you want to say, for society at large? And so those
thank you, Iqbal. Thank you very much for your fantastic 3 points, very well articulated and very succinct and very refreshing. Is there any questions to Iqbal, Nassim?
I don't have a question. I just have a general, just like if in a nice way, like.
Yes, Bilal.
Yes, this is Bilal. I don't know. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead with your comment or question.
Okay. Yeah. So my comment is, thank you. For that. The 2 verses in the Quran that mentioned the word like ra'un, that I have in the chat. The idea of guarding one's prayer, and being very like aware of one's prayer, is coupled with the idea of being able to like shepherd one's trust, and to fulfilling this going forward. So I really appreciated that, and so that theme, or those themes, I think are embodied in the idea of like what one should like shepherd. So thank you, for bringing those forward. Yeah.
There's another comment in the chat. It says, thank you very much, Iqbal. I really enjoyed your fantastic presentation. It really plucked a chord.
Iqbal, I have a question. Just your second point about Quran being accessible to everybody. I would have thought that nobody would say today, I can't read the Quran. Everyone's encouraging people to read the Quran, at least in Australia, where I'm from. I'm not sure if that's different to South Africa. There still seems to be a reluctance to read the Quran, or when they read, people don't really understand. Like, how do you overcome that problem of people's wanting to read the Quran? And if they do, how do you encourage them to benefit from it?
Yeah, so I think that there is a culture of encouraging the recitation of the Quran. What I'm talking about is obviously, yes, reciting the Quran important, but reading the Quran where you're deriving some sense of the message. That's what I'm saying. I don't feel it's sufficiently encouraged personally. I don't think it is. And I don't think, for example, it's not typically the case in the average, let's say in the typical mosque in the United Kingdom, it's not typically the case that people will be encouraged to come together. Somebody will recite a portion, go through the meaning, and just discuss. That is not typical culture. Like, so for example, now that I think is really problematic. And that's the kind of thing, to answer your question, that I think should be the case. Why are people encouraged to come to? They might be encouraged to come and listen to a talk and then go home. That's different. That's different. So that may or may not happen more or less in different places. But it's very different from a kind of the idea of us coming together, in a circle as a gathering, facilitated perhaps, but to then and to discuss the real implications. So to take the arc from here's the text, the context, meaning, reflection, pondering, implications, action. That, and I think that's the kind of thing. Well, that's the kind of thing I'm trying to do in my.
All right. Well, thank you. We have 2 questions. One from Colin and Cecilia. Colin, okay. Go ahead.
Iqbal, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that enlightening talk, and thank you for coming all the way from South Africa to speak to us. Is it fair to say that what you've been about for the last few years is trying to patch up the damage, trying to address the damage that's been done by basically centuries of desacralization, not only of our faith, of our understanding, but of the universe, and of course, secularization of our faith. It seems to be an absolutely gargantuan challenge, but that seems to be what you're about. Is that a fair assessment?
I'm not sure. If that's your assessment, Colin, then I will. I'll happily agree with your assessment, or prefer your assessment than mine. I mean, I think certainly what I am trying to do is get people to move people away from a kind of compartmentalized living, let's say, yeah, where there's like there's the religious part of them, and that's just one part, and then there's a professional part, and then there's the family bit, and like where it's just one of many different things. That's the idea. I mean, that seems to be our way of, and this is where I'm saying that I think people have maybe a greater, they almost relate more of a concern for Islam first as an aspect of who they are, than necessarily God at the center, and then everything that stems from that. So I suppose I'm trying to maybe help myself and help others just reorder that a little bit, and then examine the implications. And it becomes especially interesting when you get people to think about, so you can get people to think about the prayer, and then what about in between the prayer? So for example, just as one verse, قُلْ إِنَّ صَلَاتِي وَنُسُكِي وَمَحْيَايَ وَمَمَاتِي لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Say, indeed, my prayer, my sacrifice, my living and my dying are all for God, Lord of all that exists. So the first part begins with salah, but then the rest of it, what does it mean, my living and my dying are all for God? And to get believers to think about, okay, if I'm going to call myself a Muslim, right, can I actually give an account of my life and my decisions that aligns with this belief? And that's an interesting journey to go on and to take people on. And that's, I suppose, what I'm trying to do.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Iqbal. I'm afraid we're out of time. Can I please ask Cecilia and Yasmin to type in your questions in the chat box? And Iqbal, if you don't mind staying on and responding to the questions in the chat box, I really appreciate it. That was a great session. We'll now move on to our first paper presentation by Jamie Turner. Jamie Turner, Jamie, over to you. If you could just briefly introduce yourself before you go on with your talk, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalamu alaikum, everyone. I hope you're doing well. 1 second, I'm just trying to share my screen. So yeah, it's a pleasure and honor to be, gathering together again with you guys, and this time with an invited audience, of course. I really enjoyed the sessions yesterday, and I hope that the ones today will also be of benefit, inshallah. So obviously, my name's Jamie Turner. I'm currently a research fellow in the Department of Philosophy at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. So yeah, I'll just begin with my talk, but I want to make sure that you guys can see the transitions on my PowerPoint. Can you guys see that?
Yes, we can see. Yes, we can see, Jamie.
That's good. All right, so the title of the chapter / presentation here, as you can see, is Natural Theology as a Sign-Based Exposition, a Quranic approach to appropriating intimations of transcendence in discursive form. So the very long-winded title perhaps needs to be shortened, and it is a lot longer than my other one, which was a new Quranic natural theology. But there's something in this title which is more sort of revealing of what I'm trying to get at with my chapter. So the giveaway, of course, is that it is about natural theology. That is to say, that it's about the enterprise of trying to demonstrate or to indicate, in some sense, the existence of God from the natural world. And in doing so, it takes what it understands to be signs of God in the natural world. And this is a particular focus. And my understanding of signs, or ayat, takes on a particular understanding, which I'll try to outline in due course. So I want to just give a general outline of the chapter, of what I'm trying to get at, and then I'll try to address questions concerning the relevance and significance and importance of this work. So to begin with, as I've already hinted, natural theology simpliciter just means the enterprise or the project of offering proofs or arguments for the existence of God from the natural world, or using our natural cognitive faculties is another way of putting it. And this way of doing natural theology obviously has been going on for centuries, and I think is an important enterprise. It's an important project. However, the classical way of doing natural theology, which is sort of highly sophisticated, philosophical, it's a very detached mode of thinking, very objective, maybe cold in some sense, if we could use that term, is somehow lacking religious significance as far as I can see. And it also appeals to like an elite segment of the society or the community, the philosophers, the theologians, and I think there's something lacking for the ordinary, for the average person who comes to belief in God, and by extension belief in Islam. And I want to sort of think about how we can engage in natural theology, which is much more sort of in tune with the ordinary believer or the potential believer, because I'm thinking about this in the context of offering a natural theology to those who might not necessarily accept theism at this time. And so what I want to suggest is that the Quran offers us a kind of framework to think about how we can engage in this. And of course, I'm not just wanting to offer a way of talking about natural theology, which is, let's say, understandable and comprehensive for ordinary people, but it also must be, in my view, epistemically robust. It should be intellectually strong, sound, and coherent. That's also very important. But what might a Quranic natural theology look like? Well, I don't claim to be offering the Quranic natural theology par excellence or anything like that. When I frame this as a Quranic approach or Quranic natural theology, I'm just taking some sort of inspirations from the Quran, from what I can tell. So the Quran, when it speaks of the natural world, it invariably speaks of it as containing ayat, as signs of God, whether that be in the horizon, in the cosmos, or in the souls of people. And I think it'd be right, broadly speaking, to consider everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created and sustained, very broadly speaking, as being a potential sign of him, a potential sign of his existence, or a potential signifier of one of many of his attributes. But the Quran also presents to us a guidance for mankind, for humanity. The Quranic approach to pointing to signs of God in creation is not necessarily offering us a syllogism for the philosophers to break down, but is offering indications and pointers toward things which indicate him in the natural world for everybody. So in that sense, it's epistemically egalitarian. It's not sort of aimed at pointing to or offering reason to believe in God just for the philosophers, but for everybody at large. I would also say, though, that the Quran seems to suggest that, yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us, do they not reflect, do they not use their reason? But at the same time, the Quran also speaks of the heart, of the qalb that we have, which requires certain spiritual dispositions. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of those who don't believe, those who've rejected the faith, and he speaks of kufr in general, in terms of acquiring a kind of veil or closing upon the heart, it suggests that coming to a kind of religiously significant belief about God requires certain spiritual dispositions. And finally, the Quran, in its approach to sort of pushing us toward God, is not simply focused on affirmation that God exists, but also servitude to Him. So I think this is very important. So when we take these four basic points together, I think we generate these assumptions. So my assumption here is that, broadly speaking, everything that exists can function as a sign of God, that God created humanity to know Him, so such knowledge is open to all, that knowledge of God depends upon having the right intellectual and spiritual / moral dispositions. Yes, in order to think properly, to discuss properly, to reason properly to God, it requires intellectual virtues and dispositions, maybe open-mindedness, truth-seeking, but it also might require sort of humility as well as a spiritual or moral virtue, that that the evidence for God will come on God's terms, not yours. And there is a sense of the need for humility and various other spiritual dispositions. And as I've suggested, that religious faith requires more than mere affirmation of God. The Quranic perspective on Iman is not just tasdiq or just this assent or affirmation, but it's more than that, in my view. So if we take these four basic assumptions or points of inspiration from the Quran to doing natural theology, I think we can come to sort of a couple of basic things to bear in mind here. From assumption A and B, I think we can get the idea that we ought to think about coming to knowledge of God by focusing on what I've called intimations of transcendence in the ordinary and mundane. So an intimation of transcendence is another way of thinking about a sign of God, but in a broader sense, because it's not intimation of the transcendent, but just an intimation of transcendence in the ordinary mundane. The idea is that all of us ordinarily as human beings, whether we are talking about believers in God or Islam or non-believers, they will have experienced moments in their life which seem to give them a glimpse of something more than the material realm. That whether that be reflecting upon the beauty of the natural world, whether that be in the recognition of a moral fabric or order to the universe, whether that be in sort of loving and personal relationships, that these reveal to the individual something more than the material realm. So the idea is that, because everything can function as a sign for God, and these particular intimations of transcendence seem to be very sort of visceral and vivid and obvious, these should be sort of intimations or signs that we should focus on. And we're thinking about them in terms of, happening and occurring in our ordinary life and for ordinary people, because a natural theology that is Quranic should be focused on the ordinary individual. And moving from that, I think from assumptions C and D, we can understand that this approach to natural theology, which I'm suggesting, should approach the divine through religious involvement. Now, I say religious like that because, for instance, when we reflect on or ponder and contemplate the beauty of the natural world, there's a sense in which that's religious and another sense in which it's not, but it could be broadly religious in the sense that it evokes feelings of awe and wonder and so forth. But the basic idea, the basic point is that we ought to approach thinking about God and thinking about how we might reach knowledge of him from the natural world in a way that's not detached and sort of standoffish, but involved. that one that's focused on evoking certain experiences. And this is very important. So what I want to do now is to try and give you a sort of a better, more precise picture of how this might look. And then I'll try and address the questions concerning its relevance and significance. Now, this idea in action is just one way that we could think about doing this, or engaging in this kind of natural theology. It's not necessarily the only way. So let's take an individual, and that individual engages in some kind of musement. Okay, this idea of musement is a term borrowed from C.S. Pierce, but it's kind of free play. He uses the term free play and contemplation and thinking about the beauty that one sees in the natural world, the moral order, all these things that speak to you or speak to one as being beyond the ordinary, beyond, my apologies, beyond the mundane, beyond the material. So this in of itself is actually like spiritually involved, because this is actually a kind of tafakkur and tadabbur from the very get-go. And let's suppose, one experiences some intimation of transcendence, be that through the pure goodness that one sees in the world, but more than that, that there is an objective moral good that one appreciates and responds to, that has some kind of authority over one. It's not something that we made up. Beauty, one experiences beauty, whether that be in poetry, in art, whether that be in the natural world. And I think this is also an important point, that here I'm opening up to using art, literature in doing natural theology as well. Maybe it'll be in terms of love. Maybe it'll be in terms of feeling that desire for transcendence. So what we have is a kind of experiential input. Someone who engages in amusement will get some experiential input, okay, of this kind, beauty of the natural world, whatever it might be, okay? Now, this experiential input at this point, if we're thinking of a non-believer, is a kind of non-theistic experience of an intimation of transcendence. It's non-theistic in that one is not necessarily moving from this experience to God. One is not necessarily consciously recognizing God through this, but it's nonetheless an experience of transcendence.
And Jamie, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, no problem. So then where can we go from there? Now, I suppose that in keeping this natural theology inference focused, in that it wants to be kind of robust, epistemically robust and intellectually coherent, but at the same time applicable to the ordinary person. One way of thinking about how we could move from having this experiential input to moving to God is through offering a kind of narrative, giving an account of how one's experience neatly fits into a theistic picture of reality. Now, in doing that, there's still involvement going on. It's not like a detached situation where one takes the existence of beauty and then argues from that to the best explanation, that is God. Rather, it's offering a narrative. One is seeing the world through a certain lens. It's reading some kind of description of theism and seeing how one's experience neatly maps onto it and fits within this. So it also, in and of itself, in that it's kind of abductive and inferential, it's also experiential. Okay, and so this is what we get. We have the experiential input, and then we have our explanatory narrative. And that, the idea is that we move from that to show that theism is true. So, for example, that we recognize that there is a moral order to the universe. This fits well into the theistic narrative of the universe, and therefore this supports the idea that theism is true. However, it's more, let's say, nuanced than that. Because what happens is, when we get to the conclusion that theism is true, from this inferential process, it does something to our original experiential input. It turns it into a religious experience. So before, it was a kind of non-theistic experiential input of transcendence. But now, through this narrative, it's become a genuine religious experience. One recognizes a genuine experience of God. And so what one gets epistemically is they get, on the one hand, now experiential justification for believing in God. One is justified in believing in God through their experience of God in the world in this experiential manner. And one also gets inferential justification, believing God in a kind of discursive inferential way at the same time. So why is this particular topic relevant and important? Well, I think there's a need to extend natural theology beyond the discipline of just philosophy for the philosophers and for the elite theologians and intellectuals, but at the same time maintain it as being like epistemically robust. I find certain kinds of popularized natural theology by non-philosophers sometimes kind of almost childish and somehow not robust enough. It also brings into account the recognition that religious belief is much more about praxis than it is just as much about praxis as it is about cognition. It's about a kind of involvement, what I've called in the chapter an epistemology involvement. It's not just detached speculation. And of course,
conclude, Jamie, please, within a minute or so.
Yeah, exactly. I will. And also, it's important to try and offer, a case for why Islam and theism is sort of intellectually coherent in our secular age. I also think it addresses the problem of apatheism. People are often apathetic to religious belief nowadays. It's not simply they don't believe, they're apathetic to it. And if you engage in a kind of detached intellectual syllogism with them, it's not going to move them anywhere. But this is different because this is experientially driven and therefore pastorally relevant as well. And I think previous classical approaches have undermined certain assumptions that we've suggested are coming from the Quran. And so it's religiously significant. It's not just about affirmation. It moves you to recognize God experientially, appreciating God, evoking awe and wonder and therefore praise. And I'll leave you with this quote from Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. We now have some time for questions. Well, Jamie, I have a question. You titled your paper Intimations of Transcendence. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this particular phrase I take from the philosopher John Cottingham. And John Cottingham, in coming up with this phrase, he quotes a passage from William Wordsworth, one of his poems, and I actually had that up in the last time we were here. And basically, what he suggests is that there are certain experiences that we have as human beings, which sort of give way to something more grand, as something that suggests to us or hints to us that there's something more than simply meets the eye. That when we, for example, appreciate the beauty of the natural world, it's that experience in and of itself pushes us or uplifts us and elevates us to a sense that this world, for example, it didn't just happen by accident, that there is something above the material realm that's somehow having effect upon the material reality, perhaps, is one way of thinking about it.
All right, well, thank you, Jamie. Aisha has a question. Aisha, go ahead, please.
Hi, Jamie. Thank you so much for this presentation. This was lovely. I couldn't help but notice throughout, but especially in the beginning, your term of the natural world. And I wonder if such a phrasing might be a misnomer in the context of your outline, given that, as you're saying, all that exists looks to or signposts to its creator. And I wonder if if this is something that you're addressing in the chapter, if anything in that respect can be called natural within this sort of creator-centric framework, and what purpose such a term might serve beyond kind of still just putting everything under the umbrella of this established subfield of natural theology. Another real quick question I wanted to ask was whether existence like human emotion or thought are given any space in this thesis. I think when we talk often about everything in creation being a sign or a signpost, we might say I experience or I interact with Apple, and this Apple can offer me knowledge or a sense of the divine qualities, right, of its source of existence. But we tend to sometimes neglect perhaps other forms of creation, like frustration I might experience, or the joy that I experience once I take a bite of that apple. And so I was just wondering if that will be taken into account under this umbrella of all existing things, of how, again, perhaps the internal world of the human being might serve as well that epistemic function that you're talking about here. But thank you, this was great.
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions. So about the term natural world, yeah, I understand what you're suggesting there, because ultimately everything is kind of infused with the divine. It's difficult to make that distinction. It is difficult to mark out the distinction between the natural and the supernatural on a theistic worldview. That is true. I think I'm not too much bogged down in those details, because I think it, although it's in some sense relevant, it's not that important for me, because when I'm talking about the natural world and the beauty of the natural world, I think people generally understand what I'm getting at, essentially. But in terms of human emotion, your example, particularly of joy, I think that's certainly relevant, and it's certainly something that I have actually spoken of experiences of joy, and I don't see why those are not important in acting as kind of pointers to the divine.
Thank you. Tubana has a question as well. Go ahead, Tubana.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for the presentation. Can you please quickly go back to the sketch that you've shown us in your presentation?
Yeah.
Yes. So I was just wondering. So when we talk about the beauty of the natural world and the recognition thereof, of the moral order and everything, it almost seems like there is a necessary flow from the experiential into the explanatory, and then the equation of theism is true. But we can see that a lot of people out there don't go down that route, basically. I mean, they do recognize the beauty of the natural world. They do recognize the recognition of the moral order, and they can, and they say it, and they really indulge in that beauty. They go out onto the mountains, they enjoy being there, but it doesn't go down necessarily down the route of, saying ultimately theism is true. So how would you explain, according to this theory, why it is that, it doesn't necessarily lead to that sort of road, down that road?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I follow the view that an apprehension of God requires like a sound fitra, and requires certain spiritual virtues. So one simple way that has been sort of suggested in the literature, that there is this kind of component of sin, or a component of nefs or ego, which is involved, but other ways of pointing out potential spiritual vices that prevent one from following it through, if you will. Of course, I recognize that somebody who has supplied this explanatory narrative is not necessarily going to accept that theism is true. But what I'm trying to do is offering a way of getting them to see that, but in such a way that's not necessarily so highbrow and elitist, and also in a way that's experientially driven, such that when they accept theism is true, they're kind of prepared for servitude as well. It's not this kind of detached sort of ontological argument. Okay, therefore there is a necessary being, but okay, I don't really, what am I supposed to do next, sort of thing. So it doesn't give you that kind of preparedness that's required, I think, somehow, for worship, which is the heart of the Quranic message when it speaks of even signs of God, I think. So, yeah.
Right, well, thank you. We have last question from Saf. Saf, please go ahead.
Thank you. Jamie, brilliant presentation. Thanks for that, really informative. Just a very quick comment in light of this slide that I'm seeing. You see, if nature is used by Allah Azza wa Jal, one of the reasons is to agitate the instincts. So in order to get people, human beings to think, there's two general ways. There could be more, but there's two general ways. One, you will start to think when someone asks you a question. So if I ask you a question right now, your mind will start to think, oh, okay, what's the answer? The second way to start thinking is to agitate the instincts, i.e., for example, if your instinct of survival was agitated, like in times of war, like a storm has just happened, you start to ask 100 questions. How am I going to survive? Is the storm going to hit my house? You know, what's going to happen? Am I going to get food? What's the price? What's the cost of living now? Is it going up, going down, and so on? So what Allah does generally through the ayat, he taps into the instinct, particularly the instinct to revere, to look up to something, because that brings out your own mortality and sort of finitude and neediness and dependency and so on. So then that agitates human beings to think, right, I'm so needy and weak, and you know, what caused me? And then so here and then now the next step is categories of your thoughts to guide that questioning. So yeah, ayats are very, very important. And so it's I think I can't wait to read the paper. Obviously I've not read the paper, but inshallah, you know, it's the emotions is overlooked, because the whole reason why we have
All right, well, thank you, Saf. We'll take that as comments. And James, would you like to respond very quickly, or?
No, thanks for the comments, Saf. I agree with you 110%.
Just another quick comment in the chat box. To Banu's point, people will look at the world to affirm their own theology found in the natural world, such as theology of male ostriches.
Okay, well, we're back with our second speaker of the session, Reclaiming Space for God talk, Dr. Alireza Bojani. Alireza, would you like to briefly introduce yourself and please present your paper?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I'm Bojani. I am a teaching fellow at the moment at the University of Birmingham in Islamic theology and Islamic ethics. It's a privilege to be with this group, and my apologies to all yesterday for not being able to participate fully. Let me just share my screen and then inshallah I will begin. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, so the title of the paper, Reclaiming Space for God Talk, Theories of Ijtihad and Intra-Muslim Differences in Matters of Belief. So the rationale, part of the rationale, or the driving rationale behind the paper is to help engage with one of the broader objectives of the project, and that is a revival of God Talk. But it's not any God Talk which I would seek to help contribute to revive it. It is a substantive and dynamic God Talk. And a substantive and dynamic God Talk, I feel, demands a space and an ethics for engaging with difference. If there's no space for difference, there's little space to talk productively. Because talking with the assumption that others' opinions are flatly incorrect typically descends into dogmatic polemics, aiming to showing the other is wrong and that the self is correct. So dogmatic theology has grave spiritual and moral risks for individuals and societies, whether this be those who consider themselves scholarly individuals and within scholarly communities and societies, or whether we're thinking about individuals and societies more widely. And of course, these risks of dogmatic theology are compounded when it's held that even the slightest error in fundamental doctrine is tantamount to disbelief. So these concerns for the risks of theology are not new. One of the most influential treatments attempting to qualify these risks have been given, of course, by the giant Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. His Faisal at-Tafrika was motivated explicitly by such concerns, and some of the troubling intolerance he found within theological discourse and theological objectives of his day. Sherman Jackson describes the work as being aimed towards tempering both theological intolerance and theological indifference. Right belief still matters. And he emphasized the role for interpretation and accounting for difference of opinion, adding importantly that kufr or unbelief is only ultimately as a result of negating truth in the Prophet himself, not necessarily or considering the Prophet a liar himself, holding a belief which would be tantamount to considering the Prophet a liar. Holding incorrect beliefs isn't tantamount to disbelief. Ghazali's treatment here of, and it's translated by Sherman Jackson as the boundaries of theological tolerance in Islam. His contributions to theological tolerance in Islam have been deeply, deeply influential, both in contemporary Islamic studies literature and historically across schools and across diverse streams of thinking. However, Ghazali still held that errors in fundamental beliefs are sinful and accountable before God. He held that sin and error are co-correlates, if you like, based on his presumption that fundamental doctrines are definitive, okay, and purely rational. As he states in his Al-Mustasfa fi Ilm al-Usul, one of his later works, that the truth in such matters can be only one. Whoever is wrong about the truth is a sinner. He continues in the Al-Mustasfa to say that what did he include within these issues which he felt were the evidence for these things were definitive, and error in these issues is tantamount to sin. He included with these issues the core subject matter of Godtalk, the core subject matter of the volume which we're engaging with within this project. He gave cited examples, the origination of the world, establishing the originator, his necessary, possible, impossible attributes, the sending of prophets, blessings of God be upon them, their verification through miracles, the beatific vision, the createdness of actions, the will of the world, and everything in which there is talk amongst the Mu'tazila, the Khawarij, the Rafida, and the innovators. Of course, there are, as an Ash'ari theologian, we have to, Al-Ghazali was speaking as an Ash'ari theologian, but we should note that there are differences on the substance of each of these doctrines within the Ash'ari school itself. So we see there's a tension here between engaging in Godtalk and the risk of error, particularly when it's potentially leading to sin, and for some, actually tantamount to unbelief. Speaking to some of the comments which Iqbal Nasim mentioned, very, very useful comments, reminders that he gave us, that maybe this is one of the hesitations for people to engage with the Quran independently. They're worried about incorrect belief. Scholars, when they're engaging with theology, tend to be very flat in the discussions of theology because they're concerned with risks of unbelief, with risks of error, with risk of sin. So in the paper, what do? I want to examine theories of ijtihad in Usul al-Din as a resource for developing an ethics of Godtalk which allows for an engagement through difference rather than despite difference, without an indifference to truth or an intolerance of error. And it's also, as a footnote, it's also a reminder that the jurisprudential discourses, because obviously discussion of ijtihad is first and foremost emerged from the jurisprudential discourses of Islam. So I hope to, draw some attention to the fact that the jurisprudential discourses historically were not exclusively worldly. They were also a form of God talk. Yes, particularly through history and in the contemporary period, the way the discourses of around Sharia and fiqh are being used and applied is often, overtly worldly. But for many, it was a form of God talk. But my main concern is to examine the ideas of two very, very different thinkers. One being Ibn Taymiyyah, the 14th century Sunni traditionalist, and the other Mirza Qummi, a 19th century Shia Usuli. Both argue that sin is not necessarily concomitant with error in matters of fundamental belief, in matters of usul ad-din. Two very different thinkers who advocated different ideas. Both argue that accountability to before God in matters of fundamental beliefs is relative to sincere, rigorous personal understanding. And it seems to me that within these theories or such examples, we can see resources encouraging the development of an ethics of pursuing truth with humility and an engagement with difference. So to ground the contribution of these two thinkers, or a brief summary, because I can see my time is flying, just something about theories of ijtihad and their role in accounting for difference of opinion. So accepting a need for scholarly effort, ijtihad in its general sense, a need for a struggle to understand, intellectual understanding, suggests there will be diversity. As soon as we accept a need for scholarly effort, okay, it suggests there will be diversity, because it presumes that the evidence is not absolutely definitive, and thus difference of opinion is likely. So how to account for the difference which would emerge if we accept there is a need for ijtihad in any sphere? So this is a classical controversy in usul al-fiqh, and particularly with matters of furu' al-fiqh, so i.e. the practice of Sharia. And two broad groups of theories emerged. One is referred to as tasweeb theories or inerrancy theories, the other taqti'a theories or fallibility theories. Tasweeb theories, where there are a group of theories, there's a diversity of responses. Here I'm just summarizing broadly. They argued that in the absence of explicit texts, all suitably determined opinions are correct. Every mujtahid is inerrant or correct. Taqta'a theories, on the other hand, is only a single position. The object of research in the ijtihad in any given circumstance can be correct. Al-musib is wahid. False opinions may be authoritative and excused if procedurally sound. So this is a general framework that emerged in response to diversity of opinion with regards to Sharia practice. What about when it comes to fundamental beliefs? Okay, or if you like, with the frame of this workshop, conference, and volume in the context of Godtalk. There was wide agreement in the usul al-fiqh tradition that matters of fundamental beliefs, which were based on rationally accessible doctrines, could only have a single response, a single correct response. The correct position, and we've seen this alluded to in the Ghazali statement, which I quoted earlier on, the correct position in rational elements of fundamental doctrines is only one. Al-musib fil aqliyat is wahid. The world cannot be eternal and non-eternal at the same time. Either creation is a form of revelation, or it isn't. Okay, that is either or. And the typical, what's often portrayed as the typical position is that as we've seen in Ghazali as well, is the implications of error here has impact in the hereafter. Considered a sin, worthy of divine punishment, and for many, even a cause of unbelief. So we see there's an apparent intolerance to diversity and difference in matters of belief within, vast swathes of Muslim theologians, scholars, and jurists. Let's go to Ibn Taymiyyah briefly, and then Mirza Qummi before I wrap up. So what does Ibn Taymiyyah have to say on this issue? In his Minhaj al-Sunnah, of course, it's a polemical treatise in the context of a particular section, in the context of responding to criticism over the Sahaba. He engages within a broad discussion and again critique of various views regarding these theories of inerrancy and fallibility of the mujtahid. And he actually rehabilitates and advocates a reading of a view attributed to a much benign view attributed to Ubayd bin al-Hasan al-Anbari. Within this, he undermines the distinction between usul ad-din and furu' ad-din. Says he finds this a very problematic distinction, which is typical amongst within scholarly discourse. He says there's no grounding in the Sunnah, in the Quran, within the works of the Imams, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, he argues, undermining the distinction between usul ad-din and furu' ad-din, that God does not hold responsible beyond one's capacity, citing, of course, various verses of the Quran, and that one is responsible to be wary of God to the extent that one is capable, citing the verse from Surah Al-Fussilat. Coming to Ibn Taymiyyah's own words here, he says the mujtahid employing evidence, and here he's not talking about a mujtahid who's a specific expert in matters of Sharia inference. We can see that explicitly here. Okay, so somebody who is intellectually struggling to understand, be he an imam, a judge, a scholar, a theologian thinker, a munadir, a debater, a mufti, or other than these, somebody who's engaging in a scholarly exercise to understand, or an intellectual exercise to understand. If he infers a position and is wary of God to the extent he is capable, then this is what Allah makes him accountable to. He is obedient to Allah and deserving of reward. If he is observant of it to the extent he is capable, he will not be punished. So he is musib in the sense that he is obedient to God. He is correct in the sense that he's obedient to God. But sometimes he knows the truth as it actually is, and sometimes he does not. Now to Mirza Qummi. Mirza Qummi, very different context, very different thinker, different methodological framework, very, extensive differences of opinion on various issues with somebody like Mirza Qummi, with Ibn Taymiyyah. Mirza Qummi himself, of course, became the most important scholar of Qum in his time, studied mainly in Iraq. I won't mention some of these details. The work which I'm going to refer to here is titled Qawanin al-Usul, a very, very influential text for training Shia ulama until very, very recently. Mirza Qummi on this debate in matters of belief, again argues, like Ibn Taymiyyah, the incorrect belief does not necessitate sin nor damnation. And he challenges the typical argument. So the typical argument framed quite neatly here in light of a verse of the Quran, فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Know that there is no God but God. So there's a universal duty to know one's fundamental beliefs. So God must have given appropriate evidence. Therefore, incorrect belief reflects negligence and culpability. Right? So this is one form.
Alirza, you have 5 minutes.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So there's one formulation of a typical argument to say that, look, errors in fundamental beliefs are accountable, okay, and punishable, because God tells us to know, tells us to believe, has given us signs. If we don't get it right, we must be culpable, right? Mirza Qummi challenges this, and he says, look, this is only valid if the duty is to actually reach the truth and reality. Rather, the duty is to reach the truth in accordance to one's own investigations, assuming there is no willful negligence or minimalism, okay, in the sense, in the language Ibn Taymiyyah used, to the extent we are capable of. He drew a very important distinction, Mirza Qummi, between the principle of one's doctrines and the details of those doctrines. So the principles of doctrines he accepted may be known definitively, universally, that there is a creator, there are prophets, there is a life to come. But the evidence of these details, the evidence for all the details of these beliefs are not universally definitive. The immateriality of God, the unity of his attributes, the temporality of the world, the nature of the intricacies of these doctrines, these have been contested. They are contested. Of course, unless established explicitly by God and his prophet, after having established the truth of God and his prophet. So truth in fundamental doctrines for Mirza, like Ibn Taymiyyah, is only one, but accountability is in accordance with our subjective understanding of that evidence and of those doctrines, assuming there is no negligence or obstinacy before truth, to the extent that truth is disclosed to the seeker. Kufr then, ultimately, is to fail to submit to truth as it is disclosed to me. So what am I trying to do is build towards an ethics of God talk. This is my final slide. And this is an example of us seeing where theories of ijtihad from two radically different thinkers, different contexts, different schools, have different ideas about the details of these doctrines that we're talking about. Okay, their theories of ijtihad can allow for an embrace of differences in belief. Neither Ibn Taymiyyah nor Mirza Qummi were indifferent to truth. They all assumed there was truth in reality, yet we may all be mistaken in our understanding of it. Neither were intolerant to error. They allow for the assumption that our errors may be sincere, not unbelief, and that our errors may be salvific. Accountability is in accordance with our own capacity and with our own understanding. It seems to me that such resources may encourage us to continually engage in God talk, whether that's in a scholarly context or a non-scholarly context, reflecting over the Quran, discussing different ideas with humility through our engagement with difference. As the verse of the Quran states, Ya ayyuhan nas inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'il lita'arafu. And in my reading, this lita'arafu may be to gain in understanding through each other, not simply to recognize each other. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Thank you very much. And I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Al-Riza. That was very nice. Thank you. And we've got Bilal who put up his hand first. Over to you, Bilal.
Thank you. SubhanAllah. Thank you. Oh man, that was awesome. I appreciate you so much. Listen, my brother, I wish you were with us Friday, but alhamdulillah, let's not go back. It was decreed that you weren't there. But anyway, I really wish, because you brought up the text, by Al-Ghazali and the theological boundaries. And I want to ask you, because you brought up some other scholars in different times, but I want to ask you, in Al-Ghazali's text, both in the one that you mentioned and in a few others, it's like he's having a dialogue, a pastoral counseling between an interlocutor about an issue. And he's explicating it as a pastoral, as pastoral care for the challenges that are facing his time. He's giving a counsel to the individual, but for the flock around him, for his time. In that text on theological boundaries, I found it to be that he was talking about speculative talk about God, warning against that, because in that text he also says to talk about God in the Quran or like narratives about the prophets is where most of guidance where it will be found, and it's fine. And that little guidance comes from God talk. That is what these theologians are doing. So he differentiates God talk, and he does it in a pastoral.
Right, well, thank you, Bilal. I guess we need Al-Riza to respond to that. Yeah.
So my question is, can you see the different theologians pastorally speaking to kind of care for the individual needs and the communal needs during their time?
Thank you.
It's a brilliant question, and I think you're absolutely right that Ghazali was addressing particular needs at his time. He makes reference to them. Sherman Jackson, in his excellent introduction to the text, discusses the practice of takfir was rampant, within his own school, and he was worried about people thinking that he's gone outside the Ash'ari school. All right, okay, so it wasn't even intra-school. There was within the Ash'ari, amongst the Ash'ari theologians that were concerned about, look, this idea has gone too far, so far, and so on. So there was a pastoral concern. You know, it wasn't, here I gave a Sunni thinker and a Shia thinker. It wasn't Sunni Shia, okay? It wasn't even necessarily intra-madhab, all right? He was concerned with how rampant, okay, practices takfir had become. But the work brings forward, and yeah, first and foremost in speculative theology and kalam, but the work itself is a much broader methodological contribution, actually, I think, right? So that pastoral concern, I think, developed and allowed him, or prompted him maybe, to give a much wider methodological contribution. So it's a brilliant work, been deeply influential. But I'm still concerned, I'm still concerned with the pastoral impacts of having still maintained that errors in belief are sinful, right? Because I think that has if we think of our own pastoral context, okay, that still can dampen our willingness to engage independently, okay, with tafakkur and tadabbur, with the Quran, okay, or with each other, and so on and so forth, right? So Ghazali's massive leaps there still have that limit, where we see Ibn Taymiyyah and Mirza Qummi, okay, actually giving us resources who can help us to move beyond that as well, all right? So that, look, errors aren't necessarily sinful. This can give us a charitable engagement with the other, okay? It can help us, Ghazali is a great starting point, all right? But I think the other two can help us deal with our current pastoral issues, with Ghazali's influential contribution on board.
All right, well, thank you. We have Saifuddin has a question.
It's not a question, actually, it's a short comment. I just wanted to thank for this bringing the attention back to the ethics, from starting with the law and then moving to the ethics, because I think most of the issues currently we are facing is lack of focus on the ethics, and the humility. I think it's most important concept, as I see, because of when we look at the story of Adam and Hawa, the only thing saves Adam is his humility, that he accepts his mistake. And I think giving the chance to possibility of having a mistake is going to make life a lot easier for Muslims as well, because there is also this issue of arrogance of faith that we have been suffering, that we think our understanding of the religion is the only understanding. And I just wanted to thank that you are addressing this, you addressed this issue very well, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. We have Yasmin, you put your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I don't have a theological background, so please correct me if I'm wrong. But as I was listening to your presentation, this question came up in my mind. So as far as I can understand from reading the Quran, people of the book, which are like Jews, Christians, and I think sometimes Zoroastrians, are considered people of faith. But obviously, from an Islamic point of view, even though Christians are considered to be people of proper faith, their belief in the Trinity is wrong. So for those thinkers, those theologians who thought error meant sin, meant that that's sinful, how do they see this difference? Because on the one hand, the Quran says no, these people will not have huzn in the afterlife and all of that. How do they answer that? Am I clear?
Very clear. And so I think it's a very rich question, and so I think you are a theologian, even if you haven't had theological training. Okay, asking good questions is the first sign, I think. Right. So it's a very rich question. So actually, asking about those who would consider the errors in Christian beliefs are condemned. So the verses which you refer to, they may say that they have been abrogated or qualified. All right, so those verses, couple of verses, one in Surah Baqarah, typically they may argue, this is a trend, okay? They will say they have been abrogated or qualified by such verses like in the Deen in the Islam, the only religion with God is Islam, or they would say those verses were talking about past Christians and Jews who were correct in their understanding of belief, right, and practice. Okay, so that's one way that they would go. Those who are saying, look, incorrect belief, okay, means that they're accountable and potentially hellbound. How do we deal with those verses of the Quran which suggest that Christians and right acting Jews may be promised heaven? Okay, you know, I have problems with the hermeneutical move as well as the framework. All right, and people, interestingly, if I may, both Ibn Taymiyyah and Mirza Qumi, in the context of this discussion, both explicitly afford for Christians and other non-Muslims who are sincere, okay, in their incorrect understandings, okay, to have salvific potential as a result. All right. Ibn Taymiyyah has a long section, discusses, for example, those Christians who gave, sanctuary to the early Muslims emigrating from Mecca. Yeah, they accepted belief to the extent they understood it. Or they were believers, they protected the Muslims, although they didn't accept all of the doctrines of the Prophet Muhammad. Mirza Qumi goes further. He says that even beyond beyond Islam, okay, if the belief is sincere, okay, and there's no willful negligence in the pursuit of that belief, and there's submission to that belief, even if it denies Islam, they won't be treated as a kafir in the hereafter, okay, because they submitted to truth as it was disclosed to them. And I think
that's perfect timing. Thank you very much, Ali Riza. We will hear from our third and final speaker in this session, Dr. Mashid Turner. Mashid, over to you. If you could please briefly introduce yourself and give us your presentation.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Mashid Turner. I'm the co-director for International Foundation for Muslim Theology, and I'm based in UK, Durham. And my chapter is about angels and what the Quran has to say about them. So why did I choose this subject? The concept of angels is the second most important principle of faith in Islam. As you know, it comes after belief in divine unity, the oneness of God. The Quran tells us that we need to affirm the 6 principles of faith: Allah, angels, prophethood, revelation, hereafter, and divine determining, not just verbally, but through understanding, through tahqiq. So affirmation of God's unity is not just verbal. It requires understanding and acknowledgement by getting to know our Creator by way of manifestation of his names and attributes. So we need to ask ourselves why the concept of angels is important in Islam. How does the affirmation and existence of angels affect my faith? We need to make it personal. Therefore, it is important to reflect on what we actually know about angels. What is our perception of angels? What comes to our minds when we think about them? Angelology, study of angels, is not considered to be a scientific study, which means we can't see them under a microscope. Perhaps this is why the concept of angels has been relegated to the realm of fiction rather than fact. Hence, the depiction of angels in fiction and works of art as fairies with wings and with superhuman powers. The aim of my chapter on angels is to discard the fiction and see what the Quran has to say about angels and what is their role in our realm, the realm of creation. I felt that the first place to find out about angels was the Quran itself, and I have used the Egyptian method, which involves the examination of the semantic category of keywords which relate to the word angel, malak, in order to get as close to an interpretation of the Quran by the Quran as possible. So what is the nature of angels? The Quran describes angel Gabriel, as well as other angels, as being Prophet Muhammad's assistants. They do not have a share in God's lordship, as God is the only sustainer, the only Rabb, And angels are merely servants of God, abd, carrying out his commands. It is God who inspires angels to do the things they are commanded to do. Angels were commanded to prostrate to Adam, and all of them obeyed their Lord. Whereas all the angels praise and glorify God, they make tasbih and tahmid and taqdis. Humans have the ability to cause corruption and shed blood, yufsid and yafsik. But humans also have the ability to resist these and reach a rank above angels. So what is the cosmological role of angels? What do angels do? Angels play a central role in the interaction between God and human beings. Angels are described as messengers, rusul, who communicate God's messages to us. So they're the ones who carry the signs, the ayat, which we are meant to be reading. They descend from the unseen realm, from the alam malakut, to the seen world, to the mulk, in order to convey God's signs in every matter, amr. They are also described as witnesses in this realm, in our alam shahada. So they are the carriers of signs, conveying messages, and they can also see everything that we do. They are the ones who record our deeds, so we cannot deny any action, as everything has been witnessed and recorded, and is being witnessed and being recorded as we speak. Angels testify to God's unity through their very existence and bear witness to what has been sent down in this world. As witnesses to what goes on in every individual's lives, angels have also been given permission to ask for forgiveness on our behalf. But their intercession will only be permitted if God approves. The question then arises as to why does God need angels? The answer is that God does not need angels. We need it because we are limited. This is why belief in a transcendent God comes before belief in angels. In fact, everything centers on the notion of the transcendent God, who is non-material, indivisible, non-corporeal, and atemporal. And yet, according to the Quran, he is closer to us than our Jagadavein. How can God be nowhere and yet present everywhere at the same time? The answer is that we can never know God's essence, but we can know him through the manifestation of his names, Al-Asma al-Husna, as reflected in his creation, conveyed to us through the vehicle of angels. So what are these signs in creation that we are meant to be reading? The answer is everything. Everything is a sign. As the verses in the Quran clearly state, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, indeed within the heavens and the earth are signs for the believers, and in the creation of yourselves and what he disperses of moving creatures are signs for people who are certain in faith. So there's nothing that takes place in our creation that is pointless, that has no role to play. Everything that exists within the heavens and earth is a sign. And we need to really start learning how to read them. So who can read these signs? Everyone. Everyone can read these signs. You do not need a PhD to read these signs. The only condition for reading these signs in the correct way is to read them in the name of the Rab, the creator, sustainer, and nurturer of all created beings. Any education that does not make this connection is not complete, and in many cases becomes distorted. And this, unfortunately, is the disease of modernity and postmodernity, which cuts off that connection. Angels are therefore very much involved in the life of human beings. They are the embodiments of Sunnatullah. Therefore, there's no such a thing as luck. We have to eliminate that word from our conversations. Angels as God's slaves, messengers, and warners are the vehicle by which Allah's names are manifested in the realm of multiplicity. Belief in angels means seeing beyond the form and seeing everything in creation, from the inanimate beings such as stones to trees, animals, and even everything that happens in our lives as a missive, a sign from our Rabb, from our sustainer and nourisher to be read. And seen in this way, our whole view of the universe changes. And that's the end. You didn't have to tell me you've got 5 minutes, Mehmet.
Oh, well, that's a surprise. Thank you. Anyone have a question? All right, well, Bilal, you have a question?
Thank you for that wonderful reminder and those insights. I'm wondering, do you have a pastoral role for the angels? They are watching over us. They are guiding the messengers. So there's a lot of pastoral themes there, but do you write about any, like, the pastoral role of the roles of angels?
Yeah, I mean, mine is a kind of what would Izutsu would say is a scientific exploration, so I don't give too much opinion on this, but it's become self-evident after doing the Izutsu analysis that they do actually have a pastoral role, because they are the Hafizu, they are assistants, they're supporters, they're warners, they're messengers, they have something to communicate to us, and we can't ignore them. They say, they are the way that Allah is communicated, the means, the vehicle by which Allah communicates. So they have that specific pastoral role, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Timothy, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, please. Thank you so much, Mashid, for this talk. I'm wondering if you've explored any of the bodies of literature of Muslim near-death experiences and Muslim anecdotal accounts of encounters with angels. I know that this is it's a very popular discourse, let's say, within kind of the New Age, but actually there's quite a healthy body of Muslim literature that long before the New Age of near-death experiences and angelic encounters. And so I'm just wondering if you're integrating any of that into your research and writing.
Sounds really interesting, something good to read, but not in this, as this is just a purely an Egyptian analysis of the word malak. So to allow the Quran to speak for itself, what is the words, the connecting words with malak, in order to get an insight to say of the Quran itself, purely of the Quran itself, what the word has to say, in order to get that, because there is some hadith literature on angels, but there's very little about what the Quran itself has to say about angels. So this is purely Quran focused.
Thank you. Quran is quite rich with respect to angels as well. All right, Tubanur, you have your hand up.
Thank you very much, Mashid, for your presentation. I just have two questions. One is a follow-up question to what Bilal just said about the pastoral aspect of angels. I'd like to ask whether you can give any examples of angels' pastoral role today. I would really wonder to hear, what kind of, because I have difficulties, I guess, to understand myself. Any examples that comes to your mind in that sense? And then the second one is, how do you understand the word amr? If you can elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you.
I think the pastoral role is actually is a trend in everything, because if everything is a sign, then it's the one who is failing is me not to read beyond the sign, and the sign itself is a conduit for me to be able to stay on the right path and to follow. It gives me the opportunity to choose the right path, read the sign correctly, or ignore the sign, or read the sign and just totally not take any notice of it. So
how do I make the connection with the angels?
Sorry?
How do I make that connection? Yeah.
The angels are the vehicle by which I'm able to read the signs, because they're the carriers of those signs. If they're carrying those placards, read me in this way. But we don't go that far. We just see the form, the external, the shell of everything. And postmodernity and modernity tells us to stop there. Don't go any further. Don't read correctly. Don't read in the name of the rap. Whereas the angels are there to, to tell us, hey, read this. They're screaming out, read, but we're not reading deep enough. We're just scratching the surface. We're just looking at the material and the form. But there are examples as well within the Quran where, for example, the assistance of where the angels were sent, for example, to fight 25,000 angels, I think, were sent to fight along the side of the Prophet ﷺ, and this kind of thing, or everything that happens happens through a vehicle of angels. The story of the cave where the spider's web were outside, because they are part of the cause and effect, what we call cause and effect. These are the angels who are, this, I'm coming to your second question now. These are the things, the amr, or the commands that actually angels are carrying out through the command of Allah. They are not, there's no such thing as cause and effect. But I think there will be more of that cause and effect idea in Colin's talk. So that he will discuss that. But there is a command is what we call cause and effect, but in fact, these are what the commands of Allah carried by angels.
All right, thank you very much.
The Amr issue, I would like to learn about the Amr as well, please. It's important to me.
So Amr for Allah, it's just kun, be and it is. So it's not, but because we are in the realm of multiplicity, that command, that Amr kun, we see happening in a kind of horizontal way. So it needs to be displayed to us, not because Allah is limited, but because we're limited, through the angels, through the vehicle of angels. And as I said, and that Amr becomes visible to us in the realm of multiplicity, as we call cause and effect. But in fact, they're just verses, ayat, constantly being displayed to us by our Creator, which out of our realms actually only one could, but we see horizontally because of our limitation. And this is why angels are employed as a vehicle to carry out Allah's amr.
Well, Timothy has an additional question. Maybe follow up. Go ahead,
yeah.
Tim.
Or who? Me?
Tim first.
Okay.
Sorry, we'll go next, Bilal.
No, Bilal, I think you were before me. So why don't you go ahead, brother, and I'll follow.
God bless you. I was wondering about the correlation of like modesty and the angels. If you can remember the narration about Abu Bakr coming to the presence of the Prophet, and then Umar coming to the presence of the Prophet, and he didn't change his state. But when Uthman comes in and he lowers his like garment in the presence of Uthman, and he mentioned the angels are shy around Uthman, and so I am shy. I also, and so there's this kind of like modesty that kind of encourages the presence of the angels. And then there's the idea of good sense, smells. The angels like purity. Is that a way to pastorally use the angelic realm, and then the kind of washing of the body for the angels' greeting of the grave, and that type of, that's also like a pastoral sense of the angels showing up in the grave. Is this discussed in the chapter?
Well, I think it's that more hadith than Quran. So I'm examining just the Quran. So, but you're absolutely right. The angels occupy every aspect of our lives. As I said, there's no aspect that they don't cover.
All right. Well, thank you, Timothy.
Just wanting to connect two things. So, when Tabaner, when you mentioned the Amr, right? It also connected me to the Ruh, and the in the Tafsir tradition, as you know, Mashid, in the Tafsir tradition, the Ruh, one of the possible ways in which the Ruh is interpreted is as an angel, right? And that and there, min amri rabbi, in the Quranic dicta, sometimes that's translated as my Lord's sha'an, like it's my Lord's business. And sometimes it's as amar in like umur, business or concern. And sometimes it's translated as command. And so I'm wondering if because your focus is Quranic, if discussions of the Ruh as Jibra'il also come into those tafsir traditions that equate the Ruh with Jibra'il, if that comes into your chapter.
There's very little talk. I mean, I think I briefly talk about Ruh al-Quds, which some of us also think that it could be Angel Gabriel, and others don't. So I briefly mentioned that, but there's not that much really to indicate, because there's a difference of opinion anyway, whether it's a different angel, whether it's different Angel Gabriel, as far as it goes. But from the point of view of Amr, I'm just looking at it as command of Allah, and the angels. There's no angels that we don't have a bad angel. All the angels obeyed Allah. All of them. And the word kul is used. So they're all. And they are linked to command, to Amr. And everything is an Amr of Allah. Everything that we see is not a cause and effect, it's an Amr directly from Allah. But it's only kun as it is. And in our realm, it manifests itself through the vehicle of the angels as lots of kuns, B. And these are the signs that we have to read. And angels, there's no sense of being shy or anything, because angels come in the form that we see them. For example, in the raindrop that's carried by an angel, it comes in that form. So it's not the idea. This is what I was talking about, realm of fiction. It's not this idea of wings and or a man. I mean, the fact that revelation came to our Prophet ﷺ was in a form of a man, was that it's so that he will be recognized, so that he because prophet being limited, he came in the form of a man, but they can come in different forms in accordance to the task that they occupy. So the rain angel will come as the rain, and so on. So there's no sense of modesty, but at the same time we have to think we are not alone. They're witnesses. They're with us all the time. We're being watched.
Would it be correct then, Mashid, to say, for example, when I think about the pastoral aspect of how angels directly involved with us from a pastoral perspective, when I say an angel can come in form of a nurse in the hospital, an angel can come in form of a chaplain, at the military, to give me pastoral guidance. So the angels taking on different forms, is that a correct understanding?
The only word that I would correct would be can. They already are. When you're in hospital, you're not alone. They're there. God has sent you, that person in hospital, through his rahmah, his mercy, specifically for you. The doctor that is just seeing to you has been sent to you. His hands, how it works, everything that's been given to you is through the command of Allah, which manifests itself through the doctor, which is the apparent cause, but through the vehicle of angels. Angels are the real communicators, and that's how we should see everything. When someone smiles at you, don't just connect to that person, see it as God smiling at you through the vehicle of that person. It's now, it's happening now. Feel connected. This is how we need to be, to connect all the time, not to disconnect and say, doctor, nurse, child. It's through that connection that we become closer to our Creator.
All right, well, thank you. I have one question, Mashid. When you said everything is Amrullah, command of God, and angels are delivering, is that Izitsu's explanation, or is that something your sort of interpretation? I just wanted to clarify. I wasn't sure which one was it.
Izitsu doesn't explain. Izitsu has a theory of how to find out what the Quran has to say about the word malak. So you follow that semantic theory in order to understand what the Quran has to say about the word malak, not what Izitsu has to say.
All right, well, thank you very much. Any other question?
Is there anything in the chat box? Let's see.
Just some comments, no questions. Well, we had a really, really good 15 minutes of discussion and question time. I think that's really good. Thank you, Mashid, for your presentation. I think this is a good time to end our session 3. We will have a longer break this time, half an hour. So the conference will continue 1:40, exactly half an hour, well, 29 minutes from now. And thank you very much for attending so far. And we have one more session to go.
I'm chairing the last section of this wonderful, fascinating conference of these 2 days. And the first speaker we have for the final session is Colin Turner, who will be speaking to us about Nursian angelology.
Okay, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. My chapter is on Nursi's understanding, Sayyid Nursi's understanding of angels. So actually, I just realized now, looking at the slide, that I should have done that thing where you fade in one line by one line, as I'm going through the notes. But never mind, you can see everything that's coming already. So why have I chosen angels? The sequencing schedule of this seminar, of the presentations, and also the sequencing of chapters in our planned multi-authored volume has been worked out in such a way that my discussion of angels is preceded by Mashid's study of angels in the Quran. And that, in a sense, lets me off the hook when it comes to repeating all of the basic foundational information on angels. It allows me to dispense with the repetitious, and it allows me to launch more or less directly into the distinctly Nursian take on angels, which colors my own conceptualization of this somewhat elusive and enigmatic subject. So why my interest in angels? Well, if we accept the traditional list of principles in which investigative belief is mandatory, the Aqidah lists, belief in angels comes directly after belief in God's unity and oneness, and that's how it is also presented in the Quran. I can't recall where I read that belief in angels is actually considered by some to be a subset of belief in Tawheed. And I've often heard people say that without understanding the role of angels and their significance, divine unity and divine oneness are more or less unfathomable. And there is a tantalizing allusion to this assertion in a series of parallel debates on the use of the first person plural, the so-called pluralis majestatis, or what we call the royal we in the Quran, but that would be a digression. Another thing which impelled me to study angels was the reluctance, or we could even say the diffidence, of modern scholars of the academy to engage intellectually with the subject. This was actually brought home to me about 15 years ago, when I embarked on the supervision of a postgraduate who planned to do a PhD on angels. And I recall discussing this student at a progress review and noting the look of thinly veiled disbelief on the face of the director of postgraduate studies, that a student at the turn of the millennium was seriously countenancing a 3-year study into a subject so decidedly recondite and inconsequential. And there seemed to be a sense of distinct embarrassment in the air, a sense of puzzlement at the idea that such a subject could actually, with all seriousness, be treated discursively. And of course, it wasn't always like this. If you turn the clock back 500 years in Europe, you would encounter, well, and further afield, you would encounter a universe that was actually filled to the brim with non-rational things such as angels. Angels, it was believed, were everywhere, and lives were lived out with a distinctly unapologetic and unabashed cognizance of the importance of the unseen. This was as true in the Muslim world as it was of Christian Europe. But with the upheavals and the revolutions of the past 5 centuries, there's a whole litany of woes, the Reformation, the voyages of discovery, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, and of course the concomitant rise of materialism, naturalism, and all of their offshoots. The universe became over time secularized, and angels, along with numerous other non-rational truths and propositions, disappeared. The pre-modern universe, on the other hand, was one in which the realities of the unseen realm, the malakut, were discussed with the same seriousness of intent as the realities of the mulk, of the seen world. And in fact, mulk and malakut, as their structures suggest, were seen as the same, as 2 sides of the same coin. By the turn of the 20th century, however, the existence of the malakut and all that pertains to it was now subjected to increasingly serious and disparaging naturalistic scrutiny, as more and more souls made what the Quran calls ikhlad bil ard, this inclination towards the earth, or in other words, towards the material, towards nature, towards corporeality, towards the profane. So why my interest in Nursi's angelology? That which gave impetus to much of Nursi's discourse was the spread of naturalism, atheistic materialism, particularly as it pertains to the new Turkish Republic post-1923. And the first major section of the Risale-i-Nur, that's his magnum opus, the first major section that he wrote was his treatise on the hereafter, written allegedly after certain new Republicans had professed their disbelief in bodily resurrection. Now, Nursi was not shy of engaging with difficult, controversial subjects. And just as he was singularly appalled by this growing skepticism concerning physical resurrection, he was similarly dismayed by the inability, or maybe we should say the unwillingness, of modern Muslims, particularly those who have been captured by secularism and scientism, to treat angels as anything more than a quaint, quirky curio, if you wish. So if we're talking about relevance, why I think angels are relevant, this would be my first assertion. And that is the inability or the unwillingness to engage with angels as a serious discourse, or the tendency that some believers have to explain angels away by positing them as a collective metaphor for vague, amorphous things such as forces. And this mindset really hasn't changed in the past 100 years. And it's the same scientifically oriented mindset that interprets things such as jinn, for example, as microbes or bacteria. This need to dress the inhabitants of the Malakuti realm in what are very obviously the clothes of modernity and contemporary science really does signal for me the secular capture of the modern Muslim. It was true of the secular and the secularizing Muslims of post-Ottoman Turkey, and it is still true of many Muslims today, particularly those who are enamored of all things science and scientific, and who still use the Quran and Islam in order to validate science. So one issue which would be of considerable significance pastorally when it comes to counseling modern Muslims is this issue of scientism and this tendency that we have, unfortunately, of explaining away the non-rational by forcing it to accord with the dictates of science. I realize that I'm probably starting to approach the time limit, or maybe not. What does Nursi say about angels that makes the study of his angelology not only interesting, but to my mind, crucial? Well, angels exist, Nursi says, because the existence of God necessitates, in consequence, the existence of conscious worship. Nursi's argumentation is disarmingly simple and appealing. Since the earth is full of conscious beings who fulfill the role of conscious worship, the heavens too, he says, must similarly be populated by conscious beings. And as we know, according to the hidden treasure hadith, the whole of the cosmos is created in order that the creator be known, loved, and worshipped. The book of creation was written in order to be deliberated upon. Deliberation requires consciousness and intellection, and thus there can be nowhere in the universe that is devoid of beings who are able to read God's words. Thus, the nature of the cosmos itself demands the existence of beings who are able to appreciate the cosmos. Now, Nursi says, excuse me, the physical reach of humans and jinn is limited because they're confined to the sublunar realm. And so he says there must be a limitless number of other conscious entities throughout the cosmos who are created in order to permeate the whole of the universe with worshipfulness. The duty of angels then, first and foremost, is conscious worship, and they are deemed to be truly ubiquitous. Now, a point to note here, which I've only just realized, is that Nursi's foray into argumentation draws at the beginning a demarcation line between the sublunar realm and what he calls the heavens. And by the heavens, I assume he means outer space. And one of the reasons he makes this demarcation is to show that other worlds, stars, planets, and so on, cannot be without conscious entities. One might be forgiven with a cursory reading for thinking that Nursi is confining angels to the planets, the stars, the lower heavens, and outer space. But of course, this is not the case. In other places in his treatise, the 29th word, which is on the spirit and angels, he acknowledges that it's not just the heavens, which is the domain of angels, and that angels are actually absolutely ubiquitous, populating every last atom of the created universe. In other words, wherever there is creation, there are angels. So almost at once in this proposition, namely the fact that the cosmos is populated by conscious worship and conscious worshippers, we can see a way for our pastoral theologian, our soul healer, our shepherd, to be able to reassure his or her flock that consciousness is comprehensive and all-pervasive. And where there is consciousness, there must be meaning. And where there is meaning, there must be purpose. So already we see that our pastoral theologue is able to counsel anyone gripped by feelings of meaninglessness and despair, that there is nothing in the universe without meaning or without purpose, and that both meaning and purpose betoken a wise and just creator. So angels are ubiquitous, and ubiquity denotes universal significance. Angels, Nursi says, are ubiquitous, and when beings enjoy ubiquity, they enjoy it for a reason. Angels, we are told, are messengers. And as Mashid will have shown in her Quranic typology and her Izutzian analysis, angels bear or carry the commands, the amr of God. So the notion of ubiquitous messengers implies the reality of ubiquitous messages. However, this is something that we might have already understood from the Quran without any reference to angels. For does the Quran not tell us that the universe is full of signs, ayat, which betoken the divine? That these signs are borne or carried by angels as messengers, however, adds a very important dimension to this idea of the cosmos as a gallery of divine indications. A tree is a sign, a rock is a sign, a river is a sign, a cloud is a sign. And we know too that these signs are nothing but manifestations of the Creator's beautiful names and attributes. And so we can look at a cherry tree and we can see evidence in the creation and maintenance of that cherry tree of certain attributes of perfection. So rather than see the cherry tree as a concatenation of different pieces of matter in motion, in other words, rather than see just the material reality of the tree, which is a being made out of wood, cellulose, leaves, branches, blossoms, fruits, and so on. Instead of that, the notion of the creation as a gallery of signs allows us to see the cherry tree as a place where certain attributes of perfection are manifested. Beauty, wisdom, knowledge, generosity, order, and so on. But if we add angels to the equation, it helps us to join the dots and to complete the circle. Because the tree is not only a living being, it's a being that evinces attributes of perfection, and it also evinces purpose. And anything that evinces purpose must of necessity evince consciousness and the appreciation of meaning. And this is true of anything on the tree of cosmic existence, whether it's animal, vegetable, mineral, whether it's animate or inanimate. There is nothing in the created realm that does not exhibit a sense of purpose, however apparently animate or inanimate. And that sense of purpose and that sense of consciousness is down to the presence of angels.
5 minutes left.
This brings us to our next Nursian assertion, and that is that angels are responsible not only for bearing the commands which underpin the existence of beings, and not only for representing the consciousness and purposiveness of those beings, but they are also responsible for the glorification of God through the medium of those beings. And they do this by bearing the commands. And what does that mean? Bearing the commands of God means nothing more than manifesting the names of God in a manner which renders those names discernible, readable, and interpretable. So glorification consists of presenting those divine commands in ways which leave no doubt whatsoever to the onlooker that the beings in question have no part in their own creation, and that any attributes of perfection that one discerns belongs solely and exclusively to God. So as bearers of the divine Amr and as translators of the divine names into what Imam Ali calls the pillars of the cosmos, the angels are connected inexorably and inextricably with the creative process. And if angels are connected with the creative process, it follows on that the messages that they bring pertain to that process and need to be understood in that context. And this means that the created world, the cosmos that we perceive before us, is message rich, or we can see it as a conglomeration of interconnected messages. Here we see message and sign coalescing, because all signs are messages and all messages are signs. So the angels are thus both bearers of divine messages and, one might even say, the writers of the signs. They're also the translators of the divine names from the Malakut into the Mulk, into creational forms that are consistent with the truths of materiality and multiplicity. And from one perspective, angels may be considered synonymous with the material substrate of the cosmos. So Nursi himself and Mullah Sadra, actually before him, have asserted that those angels who are responsible for rainfall, for example, are themselves created out of rain. Similarly, the angels responsible for the creation and maintenance of the cherry tree are made or created out of those self-same components which comprise the physical being of the cherry tree. Now, there's much more I can say about angels. I know that there's not much time, and I've only just scratched the surface of the subject. The chapter will be considerably more involved, is considerably more involved thematically than I've been able to show here. For example, I go into considerable length about angels as the indispensable interface between the creator and the created. I also speculate about angels as what Nursi calls the embodiment of God's creative laws, and about how it's my contention that the angelic presence can actually be held accountable for what we tend to articulate as cause and effect. In other words, angels are everywhere. We see angels everywhere. But to bring this present very broad brush overview to a conclusion, let me say exactly why the subject of angels is important for pastoral theology. Why do angels matter? So I'm coming to the end here. They matter because their existence betokens consciousness, meaning, and purpose. These qualities reassure us that there is nothing in the creation that's futile or without a goal or without a meaning. And this is of supreme importance when it comes to positioning ourselves in the world. For the tendency and temptation to pass by the cherry tree without giving it a second thought is huge. It's overwhelming. One of Shaitan's greatest achievements, of course, we know, is to convince the gullible that he does not exist. And another achievement of Shaitan's is to convince the distracted and the negligent, once he's actually distracted them and made them negligent, neglectful, his other achievement is to convince them that the cherry tree is just a cherry tree, with no meaning other than its superficial, self-referential external meaning. A cherry tree for Shaitan, or this is how we would like to present it, is just a tall cylinder of cellulose and various other elements and compounds, with blossom producing and fruit giving capabilities. The cherry tree therefore has limited utility. Its wood may be good for making chairs and tables. Its fruit may be good for eating raw or baking in pies and pastries. But apart from that superficial utility, the cherry tree doesn't mean anything at all. It refers to nothing apart from its own being, and to talk of the cherry tree indicating some being other than itself is to deal in futile speculation, or so Shaitan would have us believe. For the theologue, of course, the cherry tree is a manifestation par excellence of numerous attributes of perfection, which make sense only if they are predicated of an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, pre-eternal, post-eternal creator. So to read the beauty, wisdom, and order of the creator in the creator's handicraft is to see the creator in all things. It is to make living and vibrant the divine declaration, فَإِنِّي قَرِيب, indeed I am near. God is he of whom the Quran says, كُلُّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ. At every moment he is in some manifestation or other. For wherever you look, there is the face of God, Wajhullah. And your face, of course, is what you're known by, and the face of Allah is what he is known by. So to realize that the universe is filled with and message rich with angels is to see all of the divine names being manifested with order and purpose in all things, inexorably and with express meaning and purpose. To realize that the angels are everywhere on a pastoral level is to understand that there are messages everywhere. It's to understand that there is no neutral ground in creation. We say, Kullul ard masjidullah, the whole of the earth is the place of prostration for the worship of God. The ard here means the earth, or in fact, creation or matter itself. There is no dark point in creation. There is no vacuum, no place that is empty or devoid of divine presence, manifestation, or attention. The ubiquity of angels leaves no one in any doubt that there is nowhere, no place, no space, no area, no part, no section of the created realm that does not speak to us of God in some way. In other words, and to finish, the existence of angels ensures that we see the universe as meaningful in every sense of the word, and that nothing, not even a single atom, is futile or without purpose. Every atom in the created realm points to the sacred. Everything is imbued with reflected sacrality. For the universe is a meaningful mirror. If you wish, you could call it a talking mirror, a speaking book, an audio book, one that speaks endlessly about its author and his infinite attributes of perfection. So they thought, along with Nietzsche, that God was dead, but the angels declare him to be Al-Hayyul Qayyum, and forever at our disposal, forever ready to hear us and to answer. No greater reassurance could we have than that which is afforded to us by the existence of angels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. That was wonderful. So we have about 12, 13 minutes now for questions. I see two hands raised. Bilal raised his hand first, and then we'll go on to Yasmin. Bilal.
Thank you for that. That was awesome. Really appreciated that. My question is just really like it is centered on when angels come in the form of like the as like as a human form, as in the famous like narration when the angel came in, and he came in, the end result was to teach you your religion. What is that a message? Is that a creation of sorts of, can that be a, because I see it as a pastoral moment, is that a pastoral kind of like message that this angel coming in human form is a teaching of how the religion should be thought of, or what are the foundations of the religion? Like, why was it necessary for the angel to come in a human form in that situation, fulfilling his role as messengership? Or
why do angels come in human forms? Is that what you're asking, basically?
Yeah, basically.
For us to understand, I mean, the problem that people had, the disbelievers had, was, why don't you send angels? Why do you send a man? But if they'd sent angels as angels are, in and of themselves, no one would have been able to discern them or understand them. So they come in forms that we can understand. So they come to us. I mean, you are this big conglomeration of atoms and neutrons and protons and flesh and muscle and all of this, and that's all mediated by angels. But there is an angelic presence in your being, because you are a collection of Allah's amr. You are a collection of Allah's kun fayakun multiplied, beyond computation. So the angels are mediating. It's a bit like, why are angels necessary for us? It's a bit like, if you look at the sun directly, and I've used this analogy before, you can't see the sun, but if you put a filter on your glasses or on your telescope or on your binoculars, then you can see it. We need angels because we can't see God directly. But you don't say that the sun needs the filter. We need the filter. So God doesn't need angels, we need them. We need a mediating substrate. We need a mediating, we need something between us and Allah. In fact, there is nothing, but from our point of view, there is. So things appear to us in forms that we can digest, including angels in the forms of, sometimes, not always in the forms of human beings, but sometimes in the form of human beings. But everywhere is full of angels. I mean, it sounds on the surface, rather strange, but if we get away from the idea of angels as fat little cherubs with wings that you see on birthday cards, or on Valentine's Day, then maybe we can understand that, angels are a serious business.
Okay, I see that Yasmin has her hand up as well.
Yeah, carry on.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask, when towards the end of your presentation, you were talking about the cherry tree and how it all works with the angel as the mediator, and you talked about the verse فَإِنِّي غَرِيبٌ and
Yes.
how it's all interconnected. I was wondering, how does that connect with the principle of Wahdat al-Wujud? And also, the second thing I wanted to ask was, just in what you were answering just now, answering Bilal, you said that there is a sort of like a hijab between us and God, but that's because we can't see God, because we need that thing because we're limited.
Yes.
How does, but then like in a lot of Sufi poems, it keeps talking about removing that hijab. So how does that work? Thank you.
I think it's because it's not removing the hijab of angels, it's removing the hijabs of neglect, and then the different hijabs, which there are supposed to be 70,000 veils of darkness, 70,000 veils of light. These are veils of multiplicity, veils of materiality, veils of corporeality, veils of neglect, veils of misunderstanding. It's those kind of veils that we have to remove. We don't remove the veil that is the angelic presence. That's not possible, because they are an inextricable part of the creation. So I don't think it's referring to that particular veil. As for Wahdat al-Wujud, it's far too complex for me to give an answer that will appear very glib if I give a quick answer. So it's not really an issue of Wahdatul Wujud here. But I can understand why you asked the question.
Thank you, Colin. I see Timothy had his hand up, and then Abdul Majid.
Yeah, Timothy.
Couple questions. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if Sayyid Nursi interprets the light verse with Allahu Nuru Samawati wal Ard, and the Mishkat and the Misbah and the olive tree and the star. Does he see all of those, that intermediation, that is, that God's light doesn't just come to the world directly, it comes through the mediation of all of these factors? Does he read that as an angelic discourse, really a discourse about angelic intermediation?
I'm not sure. I have to tell you, I don't know that, because I haven't read on the light verse in the Risalah. I'm sure he does discuss it, but when I was doing the chapter on angels, I didn't come across that as part of my reading. I focused on one particular treatise, which is the 29th word, where he talks about, I think you mentioned before, Timothy, Ruh as well, Ruh al-Quds, where he discusses Ruh al-Quds and he discusses Hayat, life, and angels in the same place, actually. No, your question's an intriguing one, and it's one I would like to research.
It seems to fit very well with what you described.
Thanks for the heads up.
And the final thing is,
if I may, maybe I know that Sayyid Nursi does discuss the whole idea of Allahu Nuru Samawati wal Ard. I don't think in direct connection with the angels, but if that treatise would be read separately, I think somebody might maybe establish a connection. It would be worth reading.
Absolutely. And then finally, you don't have to answer this now, Colin, but I just want to plant it as a seed. I'm almost hearing in Sayyid Nursi's doctrine of angelology, as you've explicated it for us, almost a kind of Islamic animism. There's a sense in which that it seems to border even on almost shamanic kind of discourse, where everything is vibrantly alive. So if everything is an angel and everything is alive, then we're almost in a kind of theistic form of animism, animistic universe, where everything is teeming with life and with light, and we're walking through a very different kind of landscape. I just want to plant that as a seed for maybe a future conversation.
These seeds that get planted are very difficult to uproot once they're planted. Once they're as interesting and as deeply rooted as that seed, then everything for Sayyid Nursi is alive, definitely. He's got a very interesting. There's a very interesting saying that he has. If the earth were as big as an apple, it would be alive. It would be living. Sorry, as small as an apple. It would be a living creature. Make of that what you will. It's about scale, isn't it? So everything for him is alive. Absolutely.
Can I just come in here? There's a part inside Nursi when he's feeling very lonely. This is the pastoral side. When he starts to realize that everything is actually alive, even stones are alive. So there's no need to feel lonely. They're speaking to you. They have a message to you. So there's nothing that's dead around there. Everything communicates. It's a very beautiful passage.
Well, he uses the example of the wooden pole or stump that the Prophet ﷺ used to lean on, and that actually it voiced distress when the Prophet moved away from it, and he extrapolates from that to conclude that everything is possessed of a voice, everything is possessed of consciousness at some level. Although obviously, on the surface of things, we see things are inanimate, we see stones as inanimate, and we need to preserve those divisions between the animate and the inanimate, because they're very useful divisions. But at base, even those stones, I think the quantum guys would tell us that there are whirring, I don't know, protons and electrons and neutrons. If I'm mispronouncing these words or misspeaking, I have no scientific background, that's why. But everything is just whirring energy. In motion, and I think Nursi would have appreciated that, and he would have adduced that as evidence of the hayat which permeates everything. Thanks to the angelic presence.
Next, we have Farhan Zaidi, who's going to be talking to us about the metaphysics of Mullah Sadra.
Salam. I'm Farhan Zaidi, currently on just my final stretch of doing my PhD at Exeter University, which focuses on Mullah Sadra, his ontology, his philosophy in general. My academic interest turned towards intellectual history, so in particular post-Abyssinian Islamic thought. My primary area of interest is the interaction between different epistemological approaches to Islamic thought, including theology, philosophy, mysticism, in informing the way religious doctrines were understood and internalized in the pre-modern Islamic tradition. So that's my main area of interest. I'm also secondarily interested in Quranic hermeneutics and engagement with the text of the Quran, and that's something I hope to explore further in future. My presentation today, I'm just going to start off with some background to my chapter. So this slide, I've only got a few slides. I wasn't sure if I was going to have slides at all, but I kind of decided that I didn't want to burden everyone with my large face on their screen. So I quickly put together these short slides. And so, yeah, so this one, just a background of the subject matter. It's not really the core aspect of my chapter. And so it's the growing development and confluence between theology, philosophy, and rational mysticism over many centuries, especially that which occurred before Mullah Sadra. These three categories are rather reductive. It's fair to say that many, if not most, of the major thinkers in Islamic intellectual history had some mixture of two or even all three of these approaches, i.e. theology, philosophy, or rational mysticism, in approaching and attaining knowledge, in attempting to understand or grasp the true nature of reality. Having said that, these autonomous aspects of each of these methods can be described as follows. So Islamic scholastic theology generally has an appeal to reason, but it's marked by a commitment to the defense of perceived religious boundaries, which varied between thinker to thinker. So whether that's literal interpretations of scripture or development of religious beliefs of a particular group, the role of reason here could vary greatly in this more dialectic method, but there usually remained a devotion to certain religious sentiments. Muslim philosophers, by contrast, are more free in this regard, especially the deductive and even inductive method of peripatetic philosophers, in that there is not necessarily a, I suppose you could say, a predetermined doctrine or understanding of scripture to defend. So rational discourse and demonstration takes precedence, to which then given religious doctrines, even major general doctrines like resurrection, are evaluated. So philosophers viewed the discourse of theologians as polemical knowledge or polemical wisdom, while they themselves, philosophers themselves, felt they held demonstrative knowledge. And so the exemplar of this school of thought is no doubt Ibn Sina, although he was preceded by the likes of Al-Farabi and to a lesser extent Al-Kindi. And then you have rational mysticism, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron. It can also be called Sufi metaphysics. Their method of arriving at true knowledge and cognition of reality almost exclusively relies on the reform and the refinement and the purification of the soul. So very little confidence is placed on rational deduction on its own. The reason I've termed them rational mystics is because once a state of significant purification is attained, mystics then use philosophical and rational language to explain their mystical unveilings or spiritual intuitions. And so they have much to say on the same topics as philosophers concerning ontology, epistemology, cosmology, spiritual anthropology, i.e. the human journey. And the exemplar of this school would most likely be Ibn Arabi, and especially those that followed him. Now, one of the ways that you can look at the difference between a rationalistic outlook and a more mystical outlook is how they would emphasize or view certain verses. So for example, I'm just trying to recall one of the verses. I think it's in Surah Tur. Am khuliqu min ghayri shay'in am humul khaliqun. So the verse says, were they created by nothing, or were they themselves the creators of themselves? So this is this rhetorical question in this verse is brutally logical. It's brutally rationalistic. It's just, where did you come from? Question yourself. Were you created out of nothing, or were you the creators of your own selves? And so that's something that the rationalist philosophers would appeal to more, whereas there are other verses of the Quran, probably most famously, huwa al-awwalu wal-akhiru wal-zahiru wal-batinu. He is the first and the last, the outward and the inward, or the manifest and the hidden, referring to God, He, which would be repeatedly quoted in the works of the mystics, as well as other verses like Allahu nur as-samawati wal-ard, which again, very profound verse and interpreted many ways. Interestingly, it's not preceded by being a simile, a mathal. The verse doesn't say Allahu kanur as-samawati wal-ard. It's not God is like the light of the heavens and the earth. It's simply God is the light of the heavens and the earth. And again, that's something that appealed to the mystics more. Right, now, generally, there's always been some kind of overlap to varying degrees. So I have some examples here of how some thinkers in recent times have categorized prior thinkers in that they mixed these different approaches to knowledge. So I'm just going to share a few examples. So those who reconciled the outward understanding and practice of religion with mystical theory, they are considered as Ibn Arabi, Abdul Razak Kashani, who was in the school of Ibn Arabi, Ibn Fahad al-Hilli, Zain ad-Din al-Amli. It's just an example of those who reconciled the outward practice and understanding of theology and religion with mysticism. Then there are those who reconciled philosophy with mystical theory. That would be someone like Al-Farabi, which might seem like a surprise, but Al-Farabi was very much a Neo-Platonist, which comes under the umbrella of mysticism and philosophy. And then you have the likes of Suhrawardi and Sayyid ad-Din Turka, those who reconciled the outward aspects of religion with peripatetic philosophy. So an example is Al-Qadi Sayyid al-Qummi. And finally, those who in some form reconciled all three methods, and in this we find Mullah Sadra. Interestingly, some have even mentioned Ibn Sina in this category as someone who combined all three. I think the reason for that is that because Ibn Sina delved into all three. Obviously, as a philosopher, he's very well known. He did many tafsir of surahs of the Quran, but also towards the end of his life, he delved a lot into mysticism. And in fact, his summary of mysticism is very famous, and it's actually quite brilliant, and it's still used today to teach mysticism and its tenets. So putting aside these rather reductive and even idiosyncratic categories, what's interesting to note and perhaps appreciate is how there was this constant wrestling between various intellectual currents. And although this would sometimes produce impassioned disagreements, it also led to a mutual growth and even narrowing of differences in certain areas to solving certain intellectual problems. In many respects, these epistemological strands began to complement each other over time. Now going on to Mullah Sadra, who puts forward a unitary approach and vision that incorporates what he terms as Quran, Burhan, and Irfan. Just a very quick introduction to Mullah Sadra, for those who may not be that very familiar with him, sorry. He's regarded as one of the most important figures of post-Abyssinian Islamic philosophy, and certainly the most prominent of his time, which is the 16th century. 16th, 17th century. His systematic thought represented a new synthetic vision of Islamic philosophy and how to approach knowledge in understanding the nature of reality. He had an immediate impact in Persia and the subcontinent, where he shifted the intellectual paradigm and continues to have a commanding influence actually in some of those areas. And studies on Sadra have started to increase in modern academia in the last few decades. The likes of Fazlur Rahman, Henry Corbin, Toshiko Izutsu, Hussein Nasser, William Chittick, and many others. And he's been variously described as perhaps one of the most, if not the most important Muslim thinker in the past 4 centuries. And so his influence in this regard, although he's in many areas, he hasn't really been exposed to to many studies, but recently in Western academia, there has been a lot more research on him, which is good. And now we find numerous comparisons between Sadra and modern analytical philosophy, which on the one hand creates dialogue, which is great. But on the other hand, there's some comparisons really do beg the question with analytical philosophers, somewhat seems a bit forced and perhaps even unnecessary, but that's another discussion. These three forms of knowledge mentioned here, Quran, Burhan, Irfan, are what he mentions in one of his works, I believe in the Mafati al-Ghaib, in its introduction, if I'm not mistaken. So this represents the confluence of rational demonstration, demonstrative knowledge, and intuitive mystical knowledge under the guidance and anchor, if you like, of revealed knowledge. So importantly, while Sadra benefits from the various delineations of past thinkers and modes of epistemology, his philosophical system is far from just being a simple syncretism or amalgamation of different theories that have been bound together. Rather, it's very much a unique and autonomous system grounded by the fundamental nature of existence, which is the hallmark of his philosophy, how he conceptualized and elaborated on the notion of existence as the primary fabric of reality. And so just as he approves of various aspects of the past tradition, he often criticizes them on certain other points and alludes to the fact that these problems that they had were the reason they were never truly able to reconcile revelation with reason or intuition in a complete holistic manner, as some attempted to do. So, as is probably quite clear from the words, Quran refers to revealed knowledge in general, in terms of scripture, incorporating Quran and Hadith as the principal source of truth that transcends other forms of knowledge. Burhan is rational and philosophical argumentation in relation to the logical and scientific nature of things, which acts as a ruler or measure between concepts and reality, as well as between concepts themselves. And Irfan, which just comes from Arafa or Ma'arif, refers to gnosis and intuitive knowledge and unveilings attained through self-purification. So Tazkiyatul Nafs, for example. And for Sadra, a true philosopher and sage and Muslim thinker who partakes in an Islamic way of life through wisdom and hikmah is very much in line with philosophy as a way of life, for Mullah Sadra himself. So moving on to my chapter, it has two parts. The first part pertains to certain doctrines related to God. The second part relates more specifically to the nature and function of divine speech. So here I'm just going to briefly sketch out the broad aspects of the chapter without going into specific details or much details at all, actually, unfortunately. I'm just going to flesh out what significance each section might have as we go along. Forgive me if some of the things I passingly mentioned seem a bit terse and incoherent. It's just I can't really go into details and explain it all, but I've tried to explain it to the extent possible in my actual chapter itself. So divine simplicity. Let me just share all the points on this. So I'm just gonna, so divine simplicity is the first part of the doctrines related to God. So the first part of the chapter related to God, it covers divine simplicity and divine attributes because these form a premise for the next part of the chapter. So divine simplicity is the first section of the chapter because it fundamentally informs the rest of the chapter, which moves on to a discussion of divine attributes and divine speech. And this perhaps already alludes to the fact that Tawheed and the primordial nature of reality and existence in its most general absolute sense forms the basis of Sadra's entire philosophy. When probing the nature of God, divine simplicity is posited against any form of intrinsic multiplicity. So to assert God is simple means to deny any composition or parts in the reality of his being. Thus divine
5 minutes left.
Okay. Thus divine simplicity is affirmation of God's absolute transcendence from all kinds of distinctions and constituents that we may ordinarily apply to other categories of things, be they physical or metaphysical. I've gone into this in quite some detail in my chapter that I can't do now, but what I would say is here, I did want to mention this common notion that as a Muslim or believer, one relevance this may have is to try and incorporate Generally speaking, we try to incorporate divine attributes in oneself, embodying the beloved's divine perfections within our actions and more viscerally within our own selves and our very inner beings. And we have many resources that discuss these noble ethical traits and how to incorporate them. Perhaps most famously, Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin. So with divine simplicity, which really upholds and affirms the doctrine and belief of Tawheed, of God's oneness and unity, we can reflect simplicity into our own lives and essentially lead a Tawheed-centric life, which of course amounts to a God-centric life through a simple approach and means of living, basically removing unnecessary complexities that are almost always self-imposed and compositions by which we might see the world and even identify ourselves with. I feel perhaps this subtle point is overlooked, is easily overlooked. In fact, I'd say I find it quite profound if simplicity is incorporated into the religious consciousness. One of the presentations yesterday, I believe it was Dr. Farial's wonderful presentation, she mentioned mental health concerns that we find prevalent. I don't think it's an understatement to say that mental health issues as a global problem is so widespread in the modern world, and it's completely unprecedented. In psychology, there is a phenomenon known as the paradox of choice. And essentially what it says is that excessive choices that we are faced with as people in the various domains of our lives are critical to our well-being and mental health. And unrestrained choices is even critical to freedom and autonomy. So though in the modern world, we have more choice than any other group of people ever has before, thus presumably more freedom and autonomy, we don't seem to be benefiting from it psychologically. And these are choices in relation to everything, be they family, career, individual needs, how we know, how we identify ourselves, and a plethora of other issues, including self-identity. And perhaps the antidote to this is voluntary simplicity, which is essentially choosing to live a simple life, leading to a much more healthier outcome. And we can certainly see this in a God-centric or Tawheed-centric lifestyle, where we seemingly reflect such simplicity into our lives. And nowhere is there a better example of this than the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. I mean, even putting aside his ascetic nature in relation to such a voluntary, simple life, just take any small example of the simple things he would do, and we see it. So for example, I've read seemingly benign hadith, which just describes something as simple as the Prophet always orientating himself physically towards Qibla, in the direction of Qibla, no matter what he was doing. So whether he was sleeping, sitting among people, sitting in a masjid, even when doing wudu, where it's not necessary, he would always face the Qibla. And it's such a simple gesture, but so symptomatic, I find, of a profoundly God-centered person, yet so straightforward and understated even, reflecting a simple direction and vision of how he orientates the vision of his whole life. Anyway, I'll stop indulging in that because this is beginning to sound like a dars. I don't want it to. The second thing is divine attributes. In the first part, I'll be very quick. I'm not going to go into the details of it. I discuss it quite extensively in the chapter. But again, just to highlight its relevance, just to delve into the philosophical mechanics of this here more than I have, a lot of research and appreciation of Islamic intellectual history either concentrates on the classical periods of the 14th century when it comes to things like divine attributes or other controversial topics. There's a whole period after that, including the Safavid period, which has been overlooked. So I think one of the good things about this chapter is just highlighting and providing a glimpse into the intellectual output in how they dealt with these issues and how it evolved and how they grew and reformed new ideas, which I think is missing from today's research into Islamic intellectual history. I know I've got to be very quick, so I will be. Just give me 1 minute. The second part is to do with divine speech, and this delves primarily into both the creative act and into communication, divine communication. I'm going to start off right here off the bat by premising this with this potential relevance. So we're very briefly touched upon the importance of how embodying and reflecting divine beliefs is important, and also how our personal intellectual endeavors and understanding our faith can be of benefit by looking at certain periods in intellectual history that have been overlooked. But there's also the issue that we face with today in particular, and that's this constant onslaught of doubt, skepticism, uncertainty towards any type of conviction. Epistemology has come under a huge scrutiny to the point that it almost seems that every avenue of endeavoring to seek true knowledge is dismissed unless it's based on a brutal, narrow, rational outlook or centered around positivist and empiricist perspectives. And of course, this has given rise to many worldviews such as atheism, agnosticism, nihilism, lots and lots of isms. And I feel like someone like Mullah Sadra can, just to finish in a few sentences, because it's very difficult to do so, but someone like Mullah Sadra and the intellectual output, generally speaking, can confront these issues because they provide a basis to answer fundamental questions that people of faith are faced with. You know, anyone who has faith, the most fundamental question is A, the existence of God, and B, how does God relate to contingent beings, to created beings? How did he create them? How is it possible for something that's absolute and transcendental to relate to something which is finite and relative? How is it possible for that creation, that process of creation to even occur? How is it then possible for communication to occur? Either way, these are very fundamental questions. And so revelation becomes a very central question amongst this huge wave of doubt and skepticism that we find ourselves with. And here, I think, is where someone like Mullah Sadra, and he's just an example that I'm presenting, but many thinkers, their output can be very useful in tackling many of these issues, not to undermine the very more traditional route, which is to have faith based on the proof of the Quran as scripture and the signs of God in creation for our own personal faith. But in this case, when we're tackling this onslaught of doubt and skepticism, these philosophies can be useful. I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to delve into anything else I have on this slide. Apologies for going over my time. I can see there's lots of comments, so I look forward to what's been said.
Thank you for a presentation, Farhan. I see a few hands up. Colin had his first, and then Mashid.
Okay, Farhan, thank you so much for that. It was amazing. One of the most amazing points I think I've heard in a long time, to do with the exhortation, you know, takhallaqu bi akhlaqillah, take on the attributes of Allah, which means don't become like Allah, become less yourself so that Allah can reflect through you. So we're not adding anything to us. But I'd always understood that within the purview of the Jamali attributes, you know, the tashbihi attributes rather than the tanzihi attributes. But divine simplicity, of course, is tanzihi. You know, God is not what God is not, and God is not composite, as you said. God is not made of parts, and so on. But to understand from that, to reflect divine simplicity, when you say it now, it sounds so simple. Sorry for the pun. But I never ever thought in terms of how do we reflect these tanzihi attributes, such as divine simplicity, by living a simple life. It's not something that most Muslims are given to, strangely enough, but it should really be intuitive on this opinion, on this understanding. So that's really, really enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your comment. I really appreciate that.
Hey, Mashid.
Thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Just really, just in case you didn't see my comment in the chat box, just there was a request, if you get a minute, to write down in the chat box the verses in the Quran that you refer to, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that. Yeah, no worries.
I see Ali Riza has his hand up.
Salam. Thank you so much, Farhan. Yeah, lots of wonderful things that you shared. So one of the things which I think many people appreciated, and I could see the comments at that point, was the link that you made with relevance between divine simplicity and Mullah Sadra's discourse, and you know, trying to, you know, the link, the pastoral link with simplicity, trying to help, and with the, you know, the mental health pandemic that we're in, right? So that was beautiful, and very much appreciated, right? The question though, so is there a tension between using somebody like Mullah Sadra to advocate this type of approach because of the complexity and sophistication of his own discourse, right? So, and again, you really nicely describe how his critical synthesis, you know, and often how he's often portrayed as this culmination, great culmination actually, of so many sophisticated in intellectual history, and then his own ideas being so frankly difficult, whether it's you know, the intellectual portrayal of his ideas, or whether it's the spiritual practical path which he advocates. So how can this stuff be? How are you advocating that it be, or what are your thoughts on how this is used to pastorally? So is it to inform scholars, you know, who may be engaging more directly with the public, or do you think his ideas can be and should be more directly translated to the, you know, non-expert?
Yeah, I don't think there's a need to necessarily teach everybody about Mullah Sadr. I don't necessarily believe that every believer needs to know all the crooks and details about Mullah Sadr's theories. I think what it does is not necessarily just the scholars, but one of the things that I actually wanted to elaborate on, but I didn't really get the chance, was to say that, I think I touched upon it at the end, was that fundamentally a Muslim's faith and their path to, let's say, the ultimate form of salvation or the peak of spiritual bliss can be attained by a very simple means. I believe that. So a very elementary understanding of how the Quran is a miracle, because it's quite evidently, clearly a miracle to a believer. It doesn't take too much effort or intellectual mentation to see that for a believer. The fact that God's signs are everywhere, again, something that becomes very apparent and obvious to those who are open to seeing it, as a believer, as a believer might believe, and then treading the path of the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and treading that path and attaining realization. Where Sadra's theory comes in, I think, is that sometimes it can, for some people, it can facilitate in understanding that path and certain aspects of treading that path. I mean, it was also well known amongst in the Prophet's time and the Imam's times and the times of certain saints after that, that they would have different circles of people around them, sometimes closer circles and sometimes wider circles. And they would, it's a very common hadith, that the prophets would talk to people based on their intellect. And so that means there must have been a smaller circle where he would only share certain kinds of information, but on the larger circle, he'll be share. So I think in that respect, someone like perhaps Mullah Sadra's approach, I'm not saying that it was his doctrines being shared by the Prophet, but this idea that there are aspects of knowledge which I think can become appropriate for certain people to help them at certain stages in their spiritual path, whenever it might be. That's one aspect. The second aspect, I think, is that it can help tackle those attacks, that onslaught that we find in the modern day, the skepticism, the atheism, and all these things. The questions that they pose, a believer might not need to be able to answer those questions, and probably can't answer those questions without it impacting his own path, spiritual path to God at all. But if we want to tackle those questions, say for the sake of da'wah, then having a philosophical sophistication, someone like Mullah Sadr and other philosophers and thinkers, they become very useful in this regard, in understanding and how, in justifying our belief system, justifying the concept of revelation, justifying the concept of God, and all these things. So I hope I answered your question, at least to an extent.
I see Timothy's got his hand up. Timothy, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Farhan, and thank you, Farial. I know that we're running short of time, and so I'll just make this comment really brief. And I just wanted to say, Farhan, that I deeply appreciated the way you spoke of philosophy as a way of life, and the compatibility of that more holistic pre-modern approach to philosophy, the compatibility of that with the religious and spiritual life. And I think that this is something that we, given our modern and postmodern lenses, we often miss when we're talking about the pre-modern philosophers, and that and even the early modern philosophers within Islam. We often forget that for them this was a holistic pathway of intellectual and life purification.
Yeah.
And
Exactly, yeah.
I just appreciated very much that you mentioned that, and I think that the revival of this understanding of philosophy could be part of the pastoral application of what you're discussing, because it's very important and it's almost never commented on.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Thank you very much for that comment. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
We missed the pastoral presence of your face, Farhan. This is not the face of a liar. That's a pastoral thing. We need to know that this is not a face of a liar. There we go. That's not the face of a liar right there.
Okay, so are there any other questions? I don't see anything in the chat. Let's see somebody just posted something.
Oh, that's
just
the verses. Yeah, the Quranic verses.
Yeah. Our last speaker is Timothy Giannotti, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, who is the loving nurturer of the creation and the all-compassionate. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad, al-Mustafa Khatam al-Nabiyyin wa rahmatan lil-Alameen, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So my name is Timothy Giannotti, and I have the pleasure of being one of Farial's colleagues at the American Islamic College, where I currently serve as the president. I'm not sure how that happened, but that's where I am, and that's what I'm doing these days. Miss very much my decades of teaching Islamic theology and philosophy and noetic mysticism, and so gatherings like this and conversations like this are very healing for me. So whether you knew it or not, you were all engaged in a pastoral activity of bringing me back to my center by having this conference. So thank you all for that. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll go from there, inshallah. So this is a project that I've been thinking about for quite some time, and this project has allowed me to really move on it and to try to give it shape and body. And so I look forward to your comments. This is what I call toward a systematic Islamic theology of Rahmah. So, I think that we, whether we like it or not, and whether we are willing to embrace the liabilities of this or not, I think that we need to have a systematic theology. And I don't mean a singular systematic theology that would be politically imposed, like the Mu'tazilites tried to impose their ideas forcibly upon the entire community. But I do think we need to develop systematic theologies so that our thinking about Islam, our talking about Islam, both externally to the wider world and internally to our children and to one another, that is coherent. And so I think that I think that we need to have something that is both revelation-based and rational. Of course, God is ineffable and God is Akbar. God is eternally beyond all theology and all of our understandings. But I don't think that religion should be ineffable. And the danger of theologies that allow for too much contradiction or cognitive dissonance or legal or ethical discourses that stand upon a foundation of divine voluntarism, the danger of that is that we can never really say that we know anything. and we can never really speak of principles that are, or ideas or practices that are good in themselves, and therefore develop rational explanations and arguments for their defense and their promotion. I've encountered divine voluntarism within the Muslim community, and I know that it's not as widespread as one might think from my presentation, but I've encountered this inability for Muslims to speak about ethics, because what is ethical is whatever God has commanded, and what is unethical is whatever God has prohibited, and that we really cannot penetrate the discussions any further. And I think that we need to develop ways that we can penetrate these discussions, and we can talk about them rationally, philosophically, theologically, with something other than a mindless or let's say an irrational or non-rational adherence to divine command and prohibition. There's also, of course, a widespread confusion about legal permissibility and ethical or moral rectitude, meaning that we often think that if something is legally permissible, then it must be morally or ethically correct. And this is a question that goes back all the way to Plato's Euthyphro, where he asks, are things good because they are commanded, or are they good in themselves and commanded because they are good in themselves? And if our legal positions are said to be revelation-based, then how can they be checked or interrogated? And I think that we need to have a theological and ethical discourse that can interrogate the legal discourse and really make sure that we're not just talking about what is permissible, but we can talk about what is right, what is life-giving, what is correct. And of course, I didn't want to get sensational, so I didn't include lots of slides about all the ways in which I think that we suffer as a community from moral blindness. But even Brother Bilal brought one up from the prison, just yesterday, this idea of locks and socks, and how we can sometimes embrace something as being legally permissible that would be an absolute violation of the very core values of our faith and the very core principles of what this revelation is about. Of course, while I think there's a danger in not having a systematic theology, I think there's also a danger in making theology systematic that we have to recognize. There's, of course, the danger of distortion and oversimplification. And we can talk about previous attempts, the most famous of which in our intellectual history might be the Mu'tazila, and the Mu'tazili ill-fated attempt to craft a systematic theology of unity and justice. I mean, at the face, unity and justice sounds quite self-evident and sounds quite, non-problematic. But the way in which they defined unity and justice led them to make claims about God being compelled to behave in a particular way, God being compelled to send sinners to the hellfire, God being compelled to send virtuous people, to paradise, and ultimately that, coupled with political power and coercive techniques, led to I think a devastating counterstrike of traditionalists and the Ash'ariyya. Not to say that that the traditionalists and the Ash'ariyya were entirely wrong in responding the way they did, but I think that the result was a deep mistrust of rationality and a tendency to accept whatever God had said, without adequate interrogation and understanding. And of course, just to go back to that, of course, not all Muslims are Ash'arites, and not all Ash'aris are subscribers to divine voluntarism. But I think it's important for us to at least identify the fact that we have had attempts, some ill-fated, to craft systematic theologies in our past, and I think the fact that they failed doesn't mean that the attempt itself is not worthwhile. But if we do that, we have to search for a universal, coherent, compelling principle to organize and systematize our Islamic theology without disfiguring the tradition. And of course, the Mu'tazilites, embrace unity and justice as their two primary principles in their systematic theology. And what I'm going to forward today is something else, and that is the whole concept of mercy. And the need, if we're going to do this, we need to find a universal, coherent, compelling principle to organize and systematize our Islamic theology without disfiguring the tradition. And of course, the Mu'tazilites tried it with unity and justice, but I'm going to try it with mercy, which after this slide, we're going to talk about it just in the Arabic as rahma, because I don't think that mercy captures everything that needs to be captured by the term. For the case that I make here for rahma, is it possible for us to say that God is bound by anything? And of course, the Ash'ari response, and in my paper, I actually quote from the creeds of al-Ash'ari and some of his theological writings, which completely detach God from any human notions of fairness or justice, even to the extent of saying that God could punish an infant in the next world with the hellfire if God wanted to do so, and it would be just, because precisely God is doing it. And so this was a reaction against the Mu'tazilites, who wanted to say that God was bound to behave in ways that to us rationally seemed just or fair. And so the question really remains, is it possible to say that God, subhanahu wa ta'ala, is bound by anything? And my argument here is that possibly, if God is the one who is doing the binding. And so this is not a Mu'tazili recycling project. Rahma is the only Quranic principle by which we can say that God has bound God's self. And of course, we find it twice in the same surah, where we read kataba ala nafsihi ar-rahma, right? There's this idea that God has written, God has enjoined, God has prescribed rahma upon God's self. And again, we read it again, that, say, right, peace be upon you, God has enjoined rahma upon himself. Your Lord has enjoined rahma upon himself. And so this idea of enjoining, this is the same, verb that we use, that fasting has been enjoined upon you, kutiba alaykum as-siyam, the idea that God writes things that are binding, that are enjoined, that are prescribed. And this is the only thing in the entirety of the Quran that we can say that God has written upon God's self. And so what is rahma then? And in my view, rahma is really the highest expression of love in the Quran. The explicit etymological connection between the raham, that is the womb or the uterus in which our lives began, and the Rahman, and the undeniable maternal connotations of rahma are very present in our traditions, right? And so this is in the hadith, and this is present in in the Quran, that we have two names of God, Rahman and Rahim, which come from the same trilateral root as Ra Ha Mim, and which denotes the womb. And so what does this connote? What does this mean for us? And it has to include notions of unconditional love, of nourishing, life-giving love, of protective love, in the same way that a mother is protective, of selfless love, a love that is not broken by transgression. The idea is that the comparison of the divine love for us in the creation and the mother's love for her child is something that is rock solid in our religious tradition. And yet, when we translate rahma merely as mercy, I think we lose all of that maternal significance of this term rahma. So in short, rahma can be understood as the nature of God's love for the creation, how God loves us, and how God is calling us to love one another.
5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay, we'll be fast. So rahma then, of course, is also the very essence of the sunnah. The entirety of the sunnah is distilled in the Quran when it says, Ma arsalnaka illa rahmatan lil alameen. We've sent you as nothing but a token of rahmah to everyone and to everything. Rahmah is thus the very essence of the Prophet's character and mission. And in fact, I think the most challenging truth about the sunnah. All the other sunnahs are pretty easy. The beard or the cane or the the high water pants. All that is easy, not to dismiss or belittle that. But truly, if we want to be people of the Sunnah, we have to aspire to be a rahmah to everyone and to everything, including a rahmah to the environment, a rahmah to neighbors, a rahmah to people we don't know, a rahmah to people who don't like us. But the principle of rahmah can also be found in the Prophet's words and deeds. And one of the things that just immediately comes to mind, of course, is the idea of loving for your brother what you love for yourself. And of course, this is not restricted to the brothers, right? But this is the idea of that you begin to place other people's well-being at least on a par with your own. This to me is a step toward rahmah, a step toward loving the way God is calling us to love and the way that God loves us. And then if we look at Surah Ar-Rahman, right, the surah really, which distills the rahmah, we see that rahmah, it is Ar-Rahman, which gives rise, Allam al-Quran, who gives rise to the revelation. It is the rahmah which is responsible for the creation of the human being. It is rahmah which is why we have been given the faculty that makes everything clear, the bayan. Rahmah is the source and the foundation for the mizan in the creation. Rahmah is the foundation for all right relationship. And I think if Surah Ar-Rahman had another name in English, I would think of it as the surah of right relationship, the right relationship between us and the creation, the right relationship between us and one another, the right relationship between the creature and the creator, of course, founded in the gratitude. Rahmah is the reason why we've been so showered with all these blessings, which should evoke gratitude and not denial. So everything comes down to rahmah. Therefore, nothing in our religion, if God has bound God's self with rahmah, and if the Prophet's mission is distilled into that one concept of rahmah, nothing in our religion can be considered outside of the context or the theater of rahmah. Indeed, if we take any aspect of our faith and practice outside the context of rahmah, it can be argued that it is no longer recognizable as Islamic. And I often use this as a litmus test for youth, that if people come to you with all kinds of hadiths and all kinds of Arabic, and they dazzle you with all of that with their clothes and everything else, but you don't detect any rahmah in their voice or their message or their manner, it cannot be your religion. Cannot be. And I think that this is something we need to discuss, we need to think about. The pastoral implications of all of this is that if God has written rahmah upon God's self, and as the messenger upon whom be God's blessings and peace was himself an embodiment of rahmah to everyone and to everything, the believers must seek to manifest rahmah in everything they say and do. And now we're not talking about just mercy. We're talking about love. We're talking about love that is nurturing, protective, unconditional, affirming everything, a love that wants to see the flourishing of the other. So there is no Islam without the rahmah. When we read that God and the messenger call the believers to that which gives life, we can therefore say that the call is to the love that gives life, to rahmah. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Timothy, for a wonderful presentation. I see two hands are raised. I see Mashid has her hand raised. Go ahead, Mashid.
Thank you for another really, really wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed listening to that. Just one question. If you said that God's love is unconditional, so I suppose you're saying that he loves us, that's why he punishes us. That's part within his love, I guess.
No, it's the only.
If that is the case, then would you say then that God also loves Iblis?
Well, it's interesting, and of course, in our tradition, we have a lot of interesting interpretation and thinking about Iblis. And so, the one thing we can say about Iblis is that he's a monotheist, right? And so, I think, and he's performing a very essential function in the world. There's no question. And so in the end, can Iblis himself be redeemed? I'm open to that. But the idea is that even punishment and even the aspects of the deen and punishments that for us to say that we can understand these outside of rahmah, that it is for us to disfigure them. That if God has written rahmah ala nafsihi, then the only way that we can properly understand anything, including the harsher aspects of the Sharia or in the intentionality of what those are. The only way that we can properly understand any of that is under the canopy of Rahmah. Because if we take it out of that canopy, then we're removing it from the one context which gives meaning and gives correct context for everything else in our faith.
All right. I see Ali Reza has a question, and then Bilal.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation and the thought and the project, which I deeply your concerns resonate with me greatly, and I really appreciate what you're doing and the contribution. The question I've got like a package of questions, but I'm going to try and just narrow it down for the sake of time. I guess at the core of it, so I completely agree with you that this the lens of Rahmah to engage with these questions is very productive. And, you know, Colin referred to it as effectively the face of Allah, you know, or offered that as a possible interpretation. And there's no doubt that Rahmah is presented as this overriding quality of God, and the references which you gave are so central. And this offer a means for us to use it as a litmus test. And if the project is about bringing God, you know, more centrally into our lives, then the conception of God, which we're bringing into the center of our lives is pivotal. How do we frame that? So Rahmah as this face, if you like, is absolutely key. So I'm absolutely on board. I guess some of the more difficult questions for me, and which resonate with the challenges that the Mu'tazili faced, or contemporary Shias face, who still maintain this emphasis on unity and a particular conception of justice, is what is the conception of Rahmah that we're going to apply as a litmus test, and how is it sourced, right? Because these are ultimate challenges when it comes to bringing in conceptions of God's justice to our appraisal of God's acts or God's Sharia as being just, right? So I think it's easy for people to be on board to say that God is qualified Rahmah. His actions are qualified by Rahmah. Therefore, his Sharia must be qualified by Rahmah, right? But now if we want to test a particular interpretation or understanding of God's religion, say, is this a manifestation of Rahmah or not? How are we conceptualizing Rahmah? So the way that you presented it was that Rahmah seems to be something which intuitively humans can grasp independent of revelation, or is it dependent of revelation? If it's dependent, we might fall into the same trap and I would call it a trap, and forgive me, that some of the Asha'ira have fallen into. That they're saying that, look, you know, if the text suggests that, I don't know, a woman shouldn't have an equal right to divorce despite being beaten and raped and so on and so forth, this is an instance of Rahmah. Okay, so that's just one example because the text says so, right? So you're nodding, so I'm sure you've got my question, and I would love to hear your kind of thoughts and responses.
No, these are great questions. And so, you know, there has to be, let's say, a deep etymological study of the trilateral root of Rahm. There needs to be a study of that, not just in the Quran, but in the, you know, in the pre-Islamic poetry, and to have a deep sense so that we can make that connection very, very clear. But we are aided by the fact that there are numerous explicit connections between God's love and the love of the mother. And so we are given this worldly referent, let's say. And granted, not everybody has a good experience with their mother. So in Christians who have bad experience with their fathers run into the same problem with the portrayal of God as a father. But the idea is that we are given a whole, you know, array, let's say, of attestations and comparisons of God's love to the love of the mother. And so we at least are given this worldly referent by which to deduce what this Rahmah must and might look like. And so I think that when it comes to the application of, let's say, the more severe aspects of the Sharia, I think that it has to be interrogated. It has to. We cannot always assume that something which is legally permissible is going to be ethically correct. You know, the last thing let's say a depressed or sickly spouse needs is another spouse who's 10 years younger in the house to, what kind of affirmation of worthiness is that? And I think that we are, as a community, we don't really have the tools to fully interrogate what is legally permissible according to the inherited traditions, and to interrogate that in the lens of rahmah. And so I think that interrogation is critically important. And so if it feels like something is a violation of rahmah, it probably needs to be interrogated, and it needs to be looked at. And I think we owe it to ourselves, to our children, to our community, to the world. We owe it to all of them to develop tools by which we can interrogate, the legal discourse, which sometimes feels bankrupt or devoid of rahmah. And so, otherwise, how can I respond to my children? They'll ask me, the Daesh, the Islamic State. So those guys are Muslims, right, Bob? And then you take a deep breath and you try to, how do I explain this contextually? And what is obviously patently a violation of everything I believe Islam to be, right? And so these are, I think that we need to develop these tools. Sorry, it's a long answer and maybe not satisfying, but it's a great question, Ali Reza. Thank you.
Okay. I see Bilal has a question, and then Saifuddin.
Yeah, quickly, first of all, thank you. I think that this needs to be more of a pastoral theology other than a systemized one. The reason why that I also think it needs to be able to hold the possibility for as Saif said, for things to be hold true for both sides. There'll be a glute theory there. And the reason for this is quite often as a chaplain, I am called in to give care to somebody who is on death row. They have 6 months or 6 weeks before they are being executed. And quite often imams, if there's a known that they've caused a public harm, they refuse to even bury them. There's no masjid that will accept them because of their public harm. So a chaplain will have to come in and offer rahmah into a particularly contradiction this person who has warranted and has done a lot of public harm. And quite often I have worked in a prison for 5 years where it was a rahmah for me not to do one-on-one pastoral work because it was a trigger. This prison that I worked in for 5 years was a prison particularly around rape, those who were rapers or those who did sexual offense. And so I had a family member who was raped young, a cousin of mine who was murdered and killed after being raped. And so for my own mercy, I refused to do a one-on-one, but it was a rahmah to myself. I still had to serve in this institution or very caring way, but for my own heart, I could not do one-on-one. So there's a contradiction there too of giving care, but yet caring for yourself and knowing those boundaries. And then lastly, I think this shows up in the Quran twice, where Allah Ta'ala says, to our beloved, prophet, you are going to worry yourself to death about these people. Guidance is for me. The prophet's grief and concern and rahmah, but Allah's warning him, do not grieve yourself to death. Don't cause yourself harm and grieving over them, because their guidance is left, for me. So we have to hold space.
Okay, I do want to give time to the answer and a couple of other questions. Well, thank you.
No, it's a powerful. I mean, this is a long conversation, Brother Bilal, and so, but I think you're right. The call to rahma is also a call to have rahma for ourselves, right? And so that's self-care has to be part of that holistic embracing of rahma. But we can this is a big conversation. Thank you, brother.
Saifuddin had a question. Do you still have a question, Saif?
Yes,
or
yes, thank you very much, Faria. Thank you. And I'd like to thank also Bilal, because it's a whole theoretical concept, theological. He just gave us a stark example of it, how it can be challenging to implement it. So Timothy, I really enjoyed the talk, and especially the bringing Rahma as a very important concept. But I'm a bit disagreeing with you. I have to disagree with you in the initial part, the historical part, because I think I consider myself more historian. I think we should try to be just in our understanding, because of course what Mu'tazila did was very brutal oppression. We should disarm ourselves, disassociate ourselves. But also I think it was for their side, it was a reaction to traditionalist oppression, that they were aligning themselves with the Umayyads. And we have the examples of Jad bin Dirham and Jahm bin Safwan brutally murdered. I think, again, going back to Ali Riza's talk, that this understanding of humility, that, knowing we might be wrong, rather than having these strong views and then attacking, I think we should try to revisit our history and also try to get rid of these kind of extreme reaction to opinions. I think that's I just wanted to clarify.
Okay, I'm just, there wasn't time to go into the origins of the Mu'tazila, and I think actually a lot of what the Mu'tazila did was brilliant, and I think also, I'm sure that they were also concerned about the Christological problem, and that's one of the reasons why they had to think about the attributes of essence versus the attributes of fi'al, and create a way that the speech, that we wouldn't fall into that Christological trap. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in what they tried to do. But I just want to make sure, do you think in arguing for a systematic, or if Brother Bilal wins the day, a pastoral theology of Rahma, do you feel like that is the enforcing of opinion upon the kind of the unnatural imposition of an opinion upon the religion of Islam, or do you think that this is something which is Quranically and prophetically justified and anchored?
Well, we all make mistakes, we think certain idea. I'm not talking about the ideas, theologies, but I'm just kind of reacting to the way that some in the past, in the early history, that Muslim scholars reacted so harshly, that created this mess. It's not just Mu'tazila, because you said Mu'tazila it was a reaction to Mu'tazila. Of course, there's that reaction, but I think we should look at the whole picture, that we are the Muslims, that in the history we made some mistakes. And we're mistakes and
we're making mistakes now. I think, and that's one of the reasons why it doesn't have to be, let's say, a theology of Rahma, but as I'm searching for a universal principle that doesn't disfigure anything when it's applied, and that is absolutely Quranically founded, I think that this may be one of our best opportunities to think systematically about a principle which should touch every aspect of our life, law, and thought. So that's all. But you're right. I think that epistemological humility is something that we all should espouse, and that's why I'm not arguing for one absolute systematic theology, but I do think we have to make Islam coherent, and we have to have some rudder or some criterion by which we can say that's just that can't be, right?
Yeah.
So anyway,
I fully agree with you. Yes.
Do we have time for one more question? I think Saf had a question.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I was just going to say, I think we might have a challenge if we foreground a single attribute for constructing systematic theology, if I'm understanding systematic theology in its assumed sense. And so, to use the language of the fuqaha, if we're going to have a qa'idah, we're going to need some dawabit. So we're going to have to set out how we're going to govern the operation of rahmah if we're going to foreground it for systematic theology. So I think that journey, we're going to have to work it out. And while we do that, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of assumptions and presuppositions that will creep in, and then explicating that is going to be another issue. So it's going to be it looks like it's going to be a very layered and involved systematization project. So all the assumptions, presuppositions, even the fact that we're foregrounded in rahmah, is itself based on a kind of assumption that, even though we use a Quranic example, but like everything, the divine also comes with a package of attributes, and the divine in context, foregrounds certain attributes over others. So I'm just thinking, I can't wait to see it, being a trained in systematic theology myself, but I would love to see how the project pans out.
Yeah, no, it's big, and I think this is just really this chapter will just be a prologue, right? And to a project which is very big. It's just that as I wade through the attributes, I see that this is the only one that is spoken of in this particular way in the Quran, and this idea of that God writing it ala nafsihi. This is very powerful Quranic legal language, right? And it's the only indication we have in the Quran that God is bound, right, by anything. And so there is a uniqueness about rahmah. It's not a haphazard selecting of rahmah out of the list of the attributes. In fact, it may be that because of this statement, we have to understand all of the attributes through the lens of rahmah because of these Quranic statements. So it may not be a perfect project, but I think that it's worth attempting, and it certainly has pastoral implications.
So we've come to the end of our time. Thanks all three of you who presented in this session. It's been a wonderful weekend, and I'll pass it on to Tuba Noor, who is our director of the program.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And thank you everyone who has presented in these last 2 days. I know that some of you have tuned in very early in the morning and some of you very late in the evening. But I think we've made it, alhamdulillah. It's been really good and really very fruitful. I would like to actually also pass on to Colin as our principal investigator, who is going to make some final remarks. Please could, after Colin's final remarks, I would kindly ask the authors of this project to stay in and not leave after Colin's final remarks. Thank you very much.
Doesn't seem to be. I think you can make the final remarks when we see the authors at the end. So I'll just wrap up for this session while our participants are present. So I just want to thank all the panelists for their really diverse and interesting chapters. This is going to be a very, very interesting book. Just looking at the angle of diversity that's going to be in there. Can you think of another book that has such diverse chapters? So I'm really, really excited about this. Also, thank the audience for being there, the participants. So this was just a flavor of what will conclude in a co-authored book. So please do visit our website for more information. And also you, the authors, will inshallah get to know, you will get to know our authors more through, this is going to be a surprise for you because you don't know it yet, but through a brief video session, which I am planning. So this is really to advertise what you do and yourself, as well as, to continue sort of joining in the conversation about Godtalk. So Yeah, and I announce the end of this seminar. Thank you again.